They took everything, her home, her money, her dignity, and they laughed as they did it. Elena Vaughn walked out of the courtroom with 3 garbage bags containing her entire life, while the rain poured down as if the sky itself were mocking her. But across the street, behind the dark glass of an armored limousine, a man was watching it all. A man the world thought was dead, a father she had almost forgotten, and he had just decided those who had destroyed his daughter had waged war against the wrong person. Like, comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far this story has progressed. And don't go anywhere because everything is about to change completely. Part 1. The Rain and the Wreckage. The courthouse steps were slick with rain, and Elena Vaughn almost went down on the 3rd step from the bottom, her left heel catching a crack in the marble that she hadn't seen because she was too busy trying not to look at anyone. 3 black garbage bags. That was what 12 years of marriage came down to. 1 in her right hand, 2 more dragging behind her left wrist because nobody had offered to help her carry them, and she hadn't asked. She didn't ask for things anymore. She had learned slowly and then all at once that asking got you nothing but the look, the particular look that Richard's mother had perfected over years of practice, that slow blink that said, "You are nobody, and you have always been nobody, and the only mistake was letting you inside our house in the first place." The rain wasn't letting up. Elena stopped at the bottom of the steps and just stood there for a moment, the garbage bags pooling water at her feet, her hair going flat against her skull. She didn't have an umbrella. She'd had one, a good one, a blue canvas one with a wooden handle that she'd bought herself 3 years ago at a shop in the financial district. But it had been in the hall closet of the house on Meridian Drive, and the house on Meridian Drive now belonged entirely to Richard Ashworth III, along with the furniture, the wine collection, the 2 cars, the savings account she'd built over a decade of consulting work, and apparently her dignity, though that last item hadn't shown up on any of the legal filings. The attorney standing beside her, the one she'd retained herself, the one whose fees she'd paid with the last of the personal account she'd kept hidden, was already stepping back under the overhang, tapping at his phone. His name was Marcus Webb, and he had done his best, and his best had not been enough, and he was the kind of man who knew exactly when to stop making eye contact. "Elena," he said it carefully. "The way you say something to a person who is standing very still in a rainstorm and might be dangerous or might just be broken. I'm sorry about the outcome. I want you to know I'll file the appeal documentation within the week. Given the asset disclosures their team submitted, there's a strong argument that—" "Don't," she said. "The pension contributions alone, if we can prove the timeline of—" "Marcus." She turned and looked at him. The rain ran down her face in channels. "Go home." He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at his phone again. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said, which meant he wouldn't, and she nodded, which meant she knew that, and he left. His footsteps retreated fast up the steps, and then she heard a door open and close, and she was alone on the courthouse steps in the rain with 3 garbage bags and the specific silence that comes after something has ended. She was 34 years old. She had a bachelor's degree she'd barely used. She had 11 contacts in her phone who she could genuinely call friends, and of those 11, 7 had drifted toward Richard's orbit over the years in the way that people drift. Slowly, plausibly, without ever committing to anything they'd later have to explain. She had approximately $400 in a checking account. She had a storage unit in the East Quarter that held a few boxes of things she'd managed to get out before the injunction, mostly books and a set of her mother's dishes that Richard had never wanted anyway. She had nowhere to go tonight. That was the part she hadn't let herself think about through the 3-hour hearing, through the reading of the judgment, through Richard's mother, Constance Ashworth, 71 years old, silk blouse, not a hair displaced, leaning over to the family's lead attorney and saying something that made him smile. Elena had sat perfectly still through all of it. She'd made herself a rule 2 years ago when the marriage was already a cold carcass and they were just working out who got to bury it. She would not give them the reaction they were looking for. She would not cry in the room. She would not raise her voice. She would not let Constance see what anything cost her. She had kept that rule today. Now, standing in the rain, alone, she thought, $400. The Holiday Inn on Fletcher Street was $68 a night. So was the Comfort Suites on Broad. She could afford maybe 6 nights somewhere before the account hit zero, which gave her roughly a week to figure out the rest of her life, which felt like either a very long time or no time at all, depending on which way she let herself look at it. She picked up the garbage bags and started walking. The rain was the kind that comes in sideways when the wind decides to participate, and within half a block her shoes were through. These were her good shoes, brown leather heels she'd bought for professional meetings for the life she'd been trying to rebuild. And they were now making a sound like wet cardboard with every step. She kept her head down. The street was the kind of street that runs alongside courthouses everywhere, lined with law offices and bail bond shops, and a sandwich place that never quite closed, and at this hour in this rain it was nearly empty. Just a few people moving fast beneath umbrellas, no one looking at the woman with the garbage bags. She was almost to the corner when she registered the car. It was parked along the opposite curb, or not quite parked, more positioned, the way a car sits when it hasn't quite decided whether it's staying. Black. The kind of black that isn't a color so much as an absence of light. The body was long and low, and she knew enough about cars to recognize that this wasn't a rental, wasn't a service vehicle, wasn't anything you'd see on an ordinary street outside an ordinary courthouse. The windows were tinted to the limit of what the city permitted, maybe past it. The engine was running. She could see the exhaust threading up in the cold air, but whoever was inside was invisible. She looked at it for maybe 3 seconds and then looked away, because standing in the rain staring at a parked car was not something she had the emotional capacity for right now, and she turned the corner and kept walking. Inside the limousine, Salvatore De Luca watched her turn the corner and disappear. He sat for a long time without moving. This was not unusual for him. He had spent 40 years in a business where the ability to remain still, truly still, not the twitching stillness of a man restraining himself, but the deep stillness of a man who had already decided, was the difference between a long life and a short one. His hands rested on his knees. His face was the face of a man in his mid-60s who had been sick for a while, hollowed at the temples, careful around the eyes, the skin carrying a yellowish undertone that his people had been paid to keep out of photographs for the past 8 months. He was dying. This was not a secret he kept from himself, though it was a secret he kept from most other people. Pancreatic. 4 months ago, the oncologist, a careful man in a good suit who had been referred by someone who understood that absolute discretion was not optional, had told him 12 months, possibly 18 with aggressive treatment. Salvatore had listened, thanked the man, and declined the treatment. He had things to arrange. Treatment would slow him down. "She has nowhere to stay tonight," said the man in the seat across from him. This was Enzo Caruso, who had been Salvatore's consigliere for 19 years, and who understood that the silence in the car right now was a specific kind of silence, and not the kind you filled with noise, but who also understood that sometimes what the boss needed was someone to say the thing out loud. "I know," Salvatore said. "We could—" "No." He said it without heat. "Not yet. Not like that." Enzo was quiet for a moment. He was a compact man in his early 50s, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that made people think he was an accountant until they looked at his hands. He'd been with Salvatore since before Elena was born. He'd helped design the original Disappearing Act, the careful architecture of distance that had kept Elena outside the world Salvatore ruled, kept her invisible to his enemies, kept her safe in the ordinary suburban life of a mother who'd understood the deal and had kept her end of it until the cancer took her when Elena was 19. "The Ashworth family," Enzo said. It wasn't a question. "Everything," Salvatore said. "I want to know everything. The debt structure, the holding companies, the property they're leveraged against. Whatever Marcus Webb missed, and he missed a great deal." A pause. "And I want to know where she goes tonight." "Already on it." Salvatore turned his head and looked at the corner where his daughter had disappeared. 3 garbage bags. He had watched her come down those courthouse steps, and the thing that had moved in him, not quite grief, not quite rage, something older and more structural than either, had been so quiet that from the outside he probably looked like a man checking his watch. He had made a decision about Elena Vaughn before she was born. He had made it the way he made every real decision in his life. Not quickly, not with emotion, but with the cold certainty that comes from understanding exactly what is true and exactly what the world is willing to do to the people you love if you give it the chance. He had been building something for 34 years. The problem was time, and the problem of time had recently become acute. "Take us back," he said. The driver, who had not spoken, who never spoke, pulled smoothly away from the curb, and Salvatore De Luca rode through the rain toward the building on Halcourt Street that his people knew as a private investment office, and that contained, behind a particular door on the 4th floor, the most comprehensive record of financial leverage ever quietly assembled against a single family in this city's history. Elena found the Holiday Inn on Fletcher Street and stood at the front desk with her wet hair and her garbage bags and her $400, and the clerk, a young man, maybe 22, who had the particular blank decency of someone who has seen enough people coming through hotel doors in bad states not to react, checked her into a room on the 3rd floor without commentary. She paid cash. She always paid cash when she could. Old habit. She didn't know where it came from. The room was what it was. Clean enough. A bed with a bedspread the color of old oatmeal. A window that looked onto an air shaft. She put the garbage bags in the corner and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them. One bag held clothes, what she'd been allowed to take. A selection that had been overseen by Richard's attorney to ensure she wasn't removing anything that might constitute marital property, which was an experience she would be processing for a long time. One bag held personal items, some photographs, a journal she'd kept for years, the small leather-bound notebook that had belonged to her mother. One bag held miscellaneous things she'd shoved in quickly during the 20-minute window she'd been given to remove her belongings from the house. A coffee mug she'd had since college, some toiletries, a cardigan she'd grabbed off the hook because she was cold. This was what remained. She didn't cry. She'd thought she would here, finally alone, but what happened instead was different, a kind of flat, pressurized silence that sat behind her eyes and didn't move. She thought about calling someone. She went through the list. Anna was in London. Tess had chosen her side carefully, and the choice hadn't been Elena's. Her cousin Derek was unreliable in the particular way of someone who means well and will always find a reason not to show up. Her mother had been dead for 15 years. She picked up the remote, turned on the television, didn't watch it, left it on for the sound. She thought about the Ashworths. This was not a productive thing to think about, and she'd been trying not to do it, but alone in the hotel room with the television playing something she wasn't watching, she let herself look at it directly. Richard had filed first. She'd been blindsided by that, which in retrospect she shouldn't have been, because Richard had been planning this the way Richard planned everything, quietly and with considerable institutional backing. Constance had been orchestrating it, which also, in retrospect, was obvious. The narrative that the Ashworth attorneys had constructed was one she barely recognized. Elena as a woman who had contributed minimally to the marriage, who had spent years living off the Ashworth name, who had resisted every opportunity to build a meaningful career, whose consulting work had been largely unsuccessful. It had been built from true facts arranged in a pattern that produced a false picture, which was exactly the kind of work Constance Ashworth was best at. Elena had watched the portrait being painted and had felt something go cold inside her. Not because it was true, because it was effective. Constance had looked at her across the courtroom with those pale eyes, and Elena had held the look and not blinked, and Constance had smiled very slightly and looked away. And that small smile had cost Elena more than anything the judge had said. She fell asleep with the television on, sitting up, still in her wet clothes. When she woke at 2 a.m, stiff and cold, she changed into dry clothes from the garbage bag, turned off the television, and lay in the dark looking at the ceiling. In the morning, she thought, start in the morning. She wasn't sure what starting meant, but the morning felt like a place to aim for. She didn't know that in a building 11 blocks away, in a 4th-floor office that didn't appear on any public registry, a man was dying and working simultaneously, seated at a mahogany desk with a glass of water he'd stopped tasting months ago, and a series of files laid out with the precision of a man who has always understood that the real work is done in silence. She didn't know that there were people in that building who had been working on her behalf for years, quietly, carefully, invisibly, in the way that a foundation is laid before a building goes up. She didn't know her name was on documents she'd never seen, attached to an entity she'd never heard of, that would, in approximately 72 hours, change everything she thought she understood about herself and about the world. 3 days later, Marcus Webb called. She almost didn't answer. She was sitting in the hotel room. She'd stayed because she hadn't been able to make herself look for something cheaper, and the money was draining, but the room had become a kind of anchor, with her laptop open and 4 job listings up on the screen, none of which she was looking at. She looked at Marcus's name on her phone and felt something that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite dread. Elena. He sounded different. Careful in a new way, not the careful of professional damage control, but the careful of a man who is working out how to say something that doesn't have a normal shape. There's a situation I need to make you aware of. Can you talk? I'm here. I received a call this morning from an attorney, a firm called Caruso and Associates, with offices on the 9th floor of the Hollander building. They specialize it's a private wealth management and estate firm, very established, very quiet. Do you know who Salvatore De Luca is? The name. She had heard it exactly twice in her life. Once when she was 9 years old, when her mother had said it late at night in the kitchen to a woman Elena didn't know, the two of them speaking in low voices that stopped when Elena appeared in the doorway. And once when she was 12, when she'd found a photograph in a box in the back of her mother's closet, a man she didn't recognize, dark-suited, standing in front of a building she didn't know. And when she'd brought it to her mother had taken it from her without speaking and put it somewhere Elena never found. No, she said, which was not exactly a lie, but was not exactly true either. He's described in the filing as an international businessman, private. He passed away 5 days ago. Marcus paused. Elena, he listed you as his sole heir. She sat very still. His legal team has been attempting to locate you for the past week. The estate I want to give you accurate information here, so I'm going to read you what their filing says. The De Luca estate, comprising holdings in international real estate, private equity, hospitality, logistics, and financial services, with a combined assessed value of, another pause, longer, the kind of pause that means the number is not a number he expected, of approximately $4.7 billion. The television was off. The room was very quiet. Outside, a car went past on Fletcher Street, its engine loud and then fading. Elena, Marcus said. I heard you, she said. They're requesting a meeting. Today, if possible. Tomorrow at the latest. Their lead attorney, Enzo Caruso, said the estate documents include, and I'm quoting now, time-sensitive material that requires the direct attention of the heir as quickly as possible. She put her hand flat on the bedspread. The fabric was cheap and slightly rough and very real. Who was he? She asked, though she already knew the shape of the answer. She had known it, somewhere deep and carefully sealed since she was 12 years old in her mother's closet. Their documentation lists him as your biological father, Marcus said, and in the silence that followed, Elena Vaughn sat in a $68 hotel room with 3 garbage bags in the corner and $400 in her account and a name she'd heard twice in her life echoing in her skull, and felt the floor shift under everything she thought she knew about who she was. She had thought, walking out of that courthouse in the rain, that the worst thing had already happened. She was beginning to understand that she'd had the order exactly backwards. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock the following morning, and that night Elena lay in the dark for a long time, running calculations that kept refusing to resolve, thinking about a photograph in a box and a woman in a kitchen who had stopped speaking when a child appeared in the doorway, and somewhere underneath all of it, beneath the fear and the disorientation and the thing that felt like standing on the edge of something vast, was a small and terrible spark she hadn't felt in years, something that felt, against every reasonable instinct, like the beginning of something. She did not sleep well, but when her alarm went off at 7, she got up. She showered. She found the least damaged of the clothes in the garbage bags and laid them out with some care. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a longer time than she usually did, not studying anything in particular, just looking. She drank the hotel coffee, which was bad, standing at the window that looked onto the air shaft. And at 9:45, she walked out of the Holiday Inn on Fletcher Street with one of the garbage bags. She'd repacked the most important things into it, the photographs, her mother's notebook, the few items she could not afford to lose, and hailed a cab to the Hollander building. She didn't know what she was walking into. She understood only two things with any certainty as the cab moved through the morning traffic: that a man she'd never known had just handed her something that might be a weapon or might be a trap, or might be something she didn't have language for yet, and that the Ashworths, Richard and Constance and the whole cold machine of that family, were still out there, still untouched, still smiling the way people smile when they're certain the game is over. They had made one assumption. They had assumed that the woman who walked out of that courthouse was finished. The cab pulled up in front of the Hollander building, and Elena paid the driver and got out and stood on the sidewalk looking up at the building's facade. 9 floors of glass and steel catching the morning light, and felt something harden in her chest that hadn't been there before. Not confidence exactly, not yet, but something closer to the territory of it, something that felt like the first thing growing back after a long winter. She went inside. The elevator took her to the 9th floor. The doors opened onto a carpeted hallway, quiet and precise, the kind of quiet that costs money. At the end of the hall was a set of frosted glass doors. Beside them, a small brass plate, Caruso and Associates. Elena Vaughn picked up her garbage bag and walked toward it. She did not know that on the other side of those doors was a man who had watched her walk through rain for the last time, and that behind him, carefully archived and meticulously organized, was the blueprint of the weapon her father had spent 34 years building and had now placed entirely in her hands. She pushed open the door, and everything began. The office smelled like leather and old paper, and something underneath both of those things that Elena couldn't name. Not cologne, not wood polish, something more elemental than that. The smell of a place where serious decisions had been made for a long time. She stood in the doorway for a moment with her garbage bag hanging from her left hand and took it in. The reception area was spare and precise. A woman at a desk who looked up without surprise, as if she'd been expecting exactly this. A woman in slightly wrinkled clothes carrying a garbage bag, arriving at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning to find out who she was. The receptionist had the particular composure of someone who has worked for powerful people long enough that nothing registers on her face unless she decides to let it. "Miss Vaughn," the woman said. Not a question. "Yes. Mr. Caruso is ready for you. If you'll follow me." Elena followed her down a short hallway. Through a door on the left, she caught a glimpse of a conference room. Long table, 6 chairs, a wall of windows, and registered that there were already people in it, 3 or 4 figures, before the door was closed again and she was being shown into a smaller room. Private. A desk, 2 chairs, a credenza along one wall with nothing on it, a man standing at the window with his back to her who turned when she came in. Enzo Caruso was not what she'd expected, though she hadn't known what she was expecting. He was compact and gray-templed, and he looked at her with an expression that took her a few seconds to identify because she hadn't seen it directed at her in a while. Genuine attention, the kind that means someone is actually looking at you rather than at the version of you they've already decided on. "Miss Vaughn," he said, "thank you for coming." He gestured toward the chair. "Please." She sat. She put the garbage bag on the floor beside her, deliberately, without apology. He noticed it and said nothing, which she filed away. He sat across from her. He had a folder on the desk, but he didn't open it immediately. He looked at her for a moment with his hands flat on the surface. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to ask you something directly. Do you know who your father was?" "I knew his name," Elena said. "I didn't know anything else." "Did your mother ever explain why?" "My mother explained very little about very many things." She held his gaze. "Mr. Caruso, I've had 3 days to sit in a hotel room and think about this. I'm not going to pretend I haven't, but I'd rather hear what you have to say than perform confusion I'm not entirely feeling." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like a recognition. "All right," he said. He opened the folder. What followed was the longest hour Elena could remember since the day of her mother's funeral, which had also been an hour of sitting very still while information was delivered that she couldn't yet make real. Enzo Caruso was methodical, and he was thorough, and he did not soften things, which she appreciated more than she would have thought. He laid it out in sequence: the estate structure, the legitimate holdings, 6 casino properties across 3 countries, a shipping and logistics company with operations on 4 continents, a chain of luxury hotels operating under 3 different brand names, a private security firm that worked with governments and corporations and didn't advertise, a network of international investments that would take an army of accountants months to fully map, the DeLuca Foundation, the humanitarian arm, charitable operations in 11 countries, clean and credentialed and publicly respected. And then, underneath all of it, the things that didn't appear in any filing, which Enzo described without euphemism and without apology, watching her face the way a man watches water when he isn't sure how deep it goes. She sat through all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How long did he know about the divorce?" she asked. "He began monitoring the situation 14 months ago," Enzo said, "when it became clear that the Ashworth family intended to pursue aggressive settlement strategy." "Monitoring," she said. "Yes." "And before that? How long had he been monitoring me?" Enzo's hands didn't move. "Your entire life," he said. The room was very quiet. Outside, the city moved past the windows, indifferent. "He never made contact," Elena said. "No. In 34 years. That was a decision he made before you were born. He believed, and the record supports that he was correct, that any contact between you would expose you to danger he couldn't adequately protect you from. The people who wanted leverage over him were very willing to use family. He had plenty of security. He had enemies who were willing to accept losses that would destroy most security operations." A pause. "He watched 2 people close to him lose children. He was not willing to take that risk with you." Elena looked at the folder, then at the window, then at Enzo Caruso. "Where is he now?" she asked. "His body. A private interment, 3 days ago. Per his instructions, there was no service." "Was I supposed to be there?" "He specifically requested you not be informed until after." Enzo's voice was even. "He said he didn't want your first engagement with this world to be a funeral. He wanted you to have the full picture first." Something moved through her chest that she wasn't going to name in this room with this man she'd met an hour ago. She breathed through it. "The Ashworth family," she said. Enzo opened a second section of the folder. "Beginning 18 months ago, Salvatore acquired controlling positions in 3 debt instruments held by Ashworth Holdings, the family's primary corporate vehicle. He did this through intermediaries across 7 jurisdictions. As of last month, Ashworth Holdings owes entities that are now part of your estate approximately $63 million in maturing debt obligations." Elena stared at him. "Additionally," Enzo continued, 2 of the properties that form the foundation of the Ashworth real estate portfolio are mortgaged against loans originated by a private lender that is also part of the estate. The properties themselves are assessed at approximately $240 million. The loans total $190. He closed the folder. "The Ashworth family's financial position is significantly more precarious than their public presentation suggests. Salvatore understood this before he began acquiring the debt. In several cases, he engineered the conditions that created the precarity." Elena sat back in her chair. She thought about Constance Ashworth's pale eyes, and the small smile, and the silk blouse that had not had a wrinkle in it at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in a courtroom. She thought about Richard in his good suit, not looking at her when the judgment was read. She thought about 3 garbage bags on a courthouse steps. "What does he want me to do with it?" she asked. "He left extensive documentation of his intentions," Enzo said carefully. "But the estate is yours, unconditionally. What you do with it is your decision." "What were his intentions?" "He wanted you to have options he never gave you." It was not an answer. She recognized that it was not an answer and that it was also, in a strange way, the truest answer available. She picked up her garbage bag, stood. "I'll need a few days," she said. Enzo nodded. He stood as well, reflexively, and she noticed that the automatic courtesy, the physical respect. "Of course. We'll arrange accommodation in the meantime. The estate maintains several—" "I have a room," Elena said. He looked at the garbage bag and then very deliberately did not look at it again. "We have a car available whenever you need it. My number is in the documentation." He picked up a card from the desk and held it out. She took it. Ms. Vaughn, there are people here, in this office and within the broader organization, who have spent years working on your behalf without your knowledge. They are loyal to what your father built. Most of them are prepared to extend that loyalty to you, but I want to be honest with you. That loyalty will need to be earned, not demanded. Earned. I understand that, she said. I don't think you understand yet what earning it will require, he said, not unkindly. But you will. She left. In the elevator going down, she pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes for 10 seconds. Exactly 10. Then she opened them and watched the numbers descend and kept her face still. She didn't go back to the hotel. She walked 3 blocks north and found a coffee shop. The ordinary kind, not expensive, Formica tables and a counter with stools and coffee that came in thick ceramic mugs. And she sat at a corner table and ordered coffee and didn't drink it and sat there for 2 hours thinking. What she came back to every time was not the money, not the scope of it, not the power of it, not the staggering, disorienting vertigo of going from $400 and a Holiday Inn to heir to an empire in 72 hours. What she came back to was the photograph. The man in the dark suit standing in front of a building she didn't know. She had been 12. She had carried that photograph to her mother, and her mother had taken it from her without speaking, and Elena had spent 22 years constructing explanations for that silence. He left. He didn't want us. He was dangerous. Her mother had wanted to protect her. Her mother had wanted to protect herself. Her mother simply hadn't known how to begin a conversation that had no good starting point. All of those explanations had been partially true. None of them had been complete. He had been watching. That was the thing she couldn't move past. He had been 40 feet away at most, across a rain-soaked street, the night she walked out of the courthouse carrying what was left of her life. He had watched her almost fall on the courthouse steps. He had watched her stand in the rain. He had made a decision that she had not known was being made, and then he had died before she could ask him a single question. She thought about what Enzo had said. He wanted you to have options he never gave you. She thought about Constance Ashworth's smile. She called Enzo Caruso at noon. I want to start tomorrow, she said. A pause. There's a considerable amount of material to... I know. I want to start tomorrow. All right, he said. And something in his voice was carefully neutral in a way that she'd learned to recognize later as the sound of a man restraining approval. 8 o'clock. I'll have the team assembled. She hung up and finally drank the coffee, which was cold. The team was 7 people, assembled in the conference room she'd glimpsed the day before, and they looked at her the way people look at someone they've been told is important when the evidence in front of them hasn't caught up with the information yet. A woman in her 40s named Diane, who ran the financial operations and had the focused economy of movement of someone who has never once been late to anything. A man named Rossi, who was younger, early 30s, with quick eyes that moved around the room in patterns Elena clocked immediately as trained habit. 2 attorneys she didn't need to know yet. A logistics coordinator named Park, who would eventually become one of the most useful people in her life. And a woman named Vita, who ran the DeLuca Foundation's public operations and who looked at Elena across the conference table with an expression of almost clinical assessment. Enzo stood at the head of the table. Ms. Vaughn has agreed to begin orientation today, he said. I want everyone to remember that she is starting without context that most of us acquired over years. Our job is to provide that context efficiently and completely. Her job is to ask every question she has, including the ones that seem too basic to ask. What's my official status? Elena asked. She directed it at Enzo, but she watched the room. You are the sole heir of the DeLuca estate, he said, which makes you the beneficial owner of every entity within it. Operationally, the transition will take some months. The captains of the regional divisions will need to be briefed. There will be relationships to establish. Loyalty within this organization is not automatic. It runs through Salvatore's memory and through demonstrated capability. You will be assessed, continuously, and by everyone. Assessed how? In every conversation you have, every decision you make, every question you ask, and every question you don't ask. He sat. The people in this room will be your teachers for the next several weeks. What you do after that is yours. She looked around the table. 7 people looking back at her. Some with neutrality, some with doubt, only partially concealed. Vida with her clinical stillness. "All right," Elena said. "Then let's start with the Ashworth debt structure. I want to understand exactly what we hold, in what form, with what legal timelines." Diane's eyes moved to Enzo fractionally. He said nothing. Diane opened her laptop. "The primary instrument is a syndicated term loan," she began, originally structured through a consortium of 3 private lenders. Salvatore acquired majority participation in all 3 instruments between 14 and 8 months ago, using beneficial ownership structures that would take a skilled attorney approximately 4 months to untangle. "Who holds the other participation?" "Entities that are cooperative," Diane said, which meant controlled. Elena filed that. "And the maturity dates?" "The first instrument matures in 11 weeks, the second in 19. The third is a revolving facility that can be called with 30 days' notice." Elena looked at her. "And what happens to Ashworth Holdings if the first instrument calls and they can't refinance?" Diane glanced again at Enzo. He said nothing. "At current leverage ratios," Diane said carefully, "they would likely need to begin liquidating the hotel properties to cover the obligation, which would trigger covenants in the second instrument that could accelerate that maturity as well." "Cascade," Elena said. "Yes." "And their ability to refinance with outside lenders?" "Constrained," Diane said. "The credit picture isn't clean. There have been some strategic moves over the past year that made that picture less clean." Elena put her hands flat on the table the way Enzo had done in their first meeting, and she thought later that she'd done it unconsciously, had absorbed the gesture and deployed it without knowing, which said something about how fast she was learning to read the room. "Salvatore arranged that," she said. "Yes?" "How long ago did he start?" "The first moves that affected their credit position were made approximately 2 years ago." Diane paused. "Before the divorce filing." The room was quiet. Elena looked at the table. "He knew it was coming," she said. "The divorce." "He had people watching the marriage," Enzo said, from his end of the table. His voice was even. "When the relationship deteriorated to a point where the trajectory became clear, he accelerated certain preparations." Elena absorbed this. The specific quality of the silence told her that everyone in the room was waiting to see how she would receive it. The surveillance, the manipulation, the elaborate machinery of her father's care that had operated entirely without her knowledge or consent. They were watching for anger, for grief, for the particular destabilizing shock of discovering you've been managed. What she felt was something more complicated than any of those things, and she was not going to put it on the table in front of 7 people she'd met 20 minutes ago. "Okay," she said. "Walk me through the hotel properties. I want to understand the asset quality before I think about the leverage." By the end of the first week, she was sleeping 4 hours a night and functioning on coffee and the specific alertness of someone who has been handed a very large and very complex problem and has decided, without quite articulating the decision, that failure is not structurally available as an outcome. The education was relentless. Diane drilled her on financial instruments with the brisk impersonal thoroughness of a woman who respected efficiency above all other virtues. Rossi. She learned that his formal role was Intelligence Operations Coordinator, which was a title that covered a considerable amount of territory, walked her through the architecture of the network, the relationships between the legitimate entities and the darker ones that sat behind them, the protocols and the pressure points. The foundation work she picked up fastest, because it mapped to skills she'd actually used in her decade of consulting: organizational management, stakeholder relations, public presentation. But the hardest education was the one nobody scheduled. It was the conversations in the margins of the day, the way Rossi's eyes tracked toward the door when she said something he thought was naive, the careful pauses in Diane's explanations that contained implicit corrections. The test Vida ran in the 3rd day, casually, disguised as a routine briefing. A scenario embedded in otherwise factual information that had a wrong answer, and a less wrong answer, and a right answer that required you to be asking the questions that weren't obvious to ask. Elena caught it. She didn't let on that she'd caught it, which Vida registered, and which moved something in Vida's assessment of her that Elena felt but couldn't yet name. Enzo watched everything from a position of studied neutrality that she was beginning to understand was not neutrality at all, but rather a very specific and very controlled form of mentorship. He would not give her answers, but he would ensure she was standing close enough to the right questions. On the fifth evening, after everyone else had left, she found him in the conference room with a cup of coffee and a legal pad, making notes. "The Ashworth situation," she said. He looked up. She sat down across from him. Not in her usual chair, which was at the middle of the table, but directly across from him, the way you sit when something needs to be said without the buffer of space. "I've been going through the documentation. All of it, not just what the team has walked me through. The acquisition structure, the debt instruments, the real estate leverage. I've also been going through the foundation ledgers for the past 3 years. And there's a payment structure in the foundation's giving program, a series of grants to women's organizations, housing assistance programs, legal advocacy groups. Over the past 2 years, those grants increased by approximately 40%. Enzo said nothing. The organizations that received the largest increases are all focused specifically on women leaving abusive domestic situations, legal support, housing, career reentry. She looked at him. "He set that up before I filed for divorce." "Yes." "Before I filed," she repeated, which means he anticipated, not just the divorce, but what I'd want to do with it, what I'd find meaningful. "Your father studied you carefully," Enzo said. "He knew who you were." "He didn't know me," Elena said. The edge in her voice surprised her, and she let it stay. "He observed me. There's a difference." Enzo considered that. "Yes," he said, "there is. He would have agreed with you." Did he think that made it better? The observation instead of contact? "I don't think he thought in those terms." Enzo set down his pen. "I think he thought in terms of what he could control and what he couldn't. He could control the preparation. He couldn't control the years he didn't give you." She stood, went to the window. The city at night, the lights and the movement, the anonymous dark mass of millions of people living their lives without knowing that in a ninth-floor office a woman was working out the terms of who she was going to become. "Tell me about the captains," she said. "The regional people? What do they know about me?" "They know Salvatore chose you. They know you are the legal heir. They know nothing about your background, your marriage, the circumstances that led to your father's decision to accelerate the succession plan. And when they find out? Some will find out, eventually. The question is whether by that point you've established enough standing that it's irrelevant," he paused, "and whether the Ashworth situation is resolved before it becomes visible." She turned from the window. "What does resolved mean, specifically?" "That's your decision to make. I'm asking for the options." The debt instruments can be extended, restructured, or called. If called and not met, we pursue standard remedies through the debt documents, enforcement proceedings, asset seizure. All entirely legal, entirely documented, entirely defensible. He picked up his pen again. Or the instruments can be sold to a third party at a discount, removing us from the picture entirely and letting the Ashworths deal with whoever buys the paper. Or, he paused, they can be restructured on terms you set, terms that require something in return. What did Salvatore intend? He left that document in the file marked for your decision. She stared at him. You keep doing that. Yes. He left instructions for everything else. He left information for everything else, Enzo corrected. He was very deliberate about the distinction. He wanted you to have every piece of information he had. He did not want you to be executing his instructions. He wanted you to make the decisions. She was quiet for a moment. Why? Because the organization will follow instructions from a dead man for only so long, Enzo said, and because he didn't want a caretaker. He wanted a successor. The seventh day was when it cracked. She came in at 7:30 and found Rossi in her office. Her office now, a room adjacent to the conference room that had been cleared and arranged with the minimum necessary furniture, a desk, and 2 chairs, and a secure laptop and a phone. Standing with his arms crossed, and a specific expression on his face that she'd learned meant he'd spent the night awake because something had moved. Close the door, she said. He did. Talk. The Ashworth family retained a forensic accounting firm 6 days ago, he said. specialists in debt structure analysis and beneficial ownership tracing. The same firm that the Donati Group used in 2019 when someone started buying their paper. He paused. They know something's wrong with their credit picture. They're starting to look for who's behind it. Elena sat down. Timeline on the first debt maturity? 9 weeks now. How long until the forensic firm can trace the ownership structure back to the estate? Rossi's expression said he'd already run this. If they're good, 4 to 6 weeks. If they're very good, 3. Which meant there was a window, and the window was narrowing. Who knows about this? She asked. Diane. Enzo. Now you. Does Enzo know you're in here right now? Rossi's jaw moved slightly. I came to you first. She looked at him. He looked back, something testing in it. Why? She asked. A pause. Because you asked the right question in the Vita briefing on day 3, he said. And because you didn't make a thing out of catching it. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Get Enzo and Diane in the conference room in 20 minutes, she said. He went. She sat alone in the office for 60 seconds, doing the math. Not the financial math, which she'd get to, but the other math. The math of time and visibility and what needed to happen in what order. The Ashworths were moving. They didn't know what they'd found yet, but they were looking. And the moment they traced the beneficial ownership back to the DeLuca estate, the situation would change in ways that couldn't be controlled, which meant the next move had to happen before they looked up from their findings. She went to the conference room. Diane had her laptop already open. Enzo stood at the window, which she was starting to understand was where he stood when he was thinking rather than when he was ready, and he turned when she came in. You've spoken with Rossi, he said. Yes. She sat. I want to move on the first debt instrument, not wait for maturity. I want to send notice of a technical covenant breach that I believe exists in the documentation. Diane, does it? Diane was already looking. A moment. Clause 14b, she said. Reporting requirements. They missed a quarterly disclosure filing. It's a minor breach, but it's documented. Under the terms of that clause, what's our right? Notice of breach and a 30-day cure period. If not cured, acceleration of the maturity. Which means the full instrument comes due in 30 days rather than 9 weeks. Yes. Elena looked at Enzo. He was very still. I want to send the notice today, she said. That will tell them someone is watching very closely, Enzo said. It will accelerate their investigation. Their investigation was already going to find us in 3 to 6 weeks, she said. I'd rather be in a position of having moved first than one of being found. She looked at Diane. If the notice goes today and they can't cure the breach, what's the cascade? They'll need to refinance the full instrument in 30 days. At current market conditions and their credit picture, which we've partially shaped, their options are limited. They'd need to either liquidate assets or find a lender willing to take them at significant risk premium. And if they liquidate? The properties they'd most likely sell are the ones mortgaged against our secondary instrument. The sale of those properties could trigger the change of control provision in the second loan, which means the second instrument could accelerate too. Yes, the room was very quiet. That's the whole foundation, Elena said. Not with satisfaction, just stating a fact. It's the financial foundation, Enzo said carefully. The Ashworth family still has significant personal assets, political relationships, social capital. I know, Elena said. I'm not trying to destroy them. She looked at the table, then at Enzo. I'm trying to make them understand what position they're in before they understand who put them there. Because once they know it's me, they'll spend everything they have fighting the messenger instead of looking at the message. She paused. Do you understand what I'm doing? Enzo looked at her for a long moment. You're not executing your father's plan, he said. No. You're executing yours. She held his gaze. Send the notice, she said. Diane's hands moved to her keyboard. And somewhere across the city, in the Ashworth family's primary corporate office on the 32nd floor of a glass tower that their name was nowhere near, a forensic accountant was pulling at a thread that led to a name that led to a dead man, that led to a woman who had walked out of a courthouse 6 days ago with 3 garbage bags, And the accountant didn't know yet what he had, but the thread was moving in his hands, and in approximately 72 hours he was going to look up from his screen and say the name DeLuca for the first time. And everything that followed would be... The notice went out at 11:47 in the morning, and by 3 p.m. Rossi's phone was picking up the first tremors. He came into the conference room where Elena was sitting with Diane going through the secondary instrument line by line, and he put his phone on the table face up without saying anything. On the screen was a message, 3 words from a contact whose name Elena didn't recognize. They're calling everyone. She looked at Rossi. The Ashworth attorneys have started making calls to the original lending consortium, he said, trying to find out who bought the participation. The forensic firm they retained, they moved faster than we projected. They've already traced 2 of the 3 intermediary layers. How long to the 3rd? Elena asked. 18 hours. Maybe less. They're good. Diane closed her laptop with a sound that was very small in the quiet room. Elena looked at the table. She thought about the forensic accountant pulling threads, and she thought about the 30-day cure clock that had just started, and she did the arithmetic of competing timelines in her head with the specific cold focus she'd been discovering in herself over the past week. The ability to strip emotion out of a calculation without losing the understanding of what the numbers meant to actual people. Then we have 18 hours to establish the narrative before they establish theirs, she said. Rossi sat down. What's the narrative? That this is a legitimate creditor enforcing legitimate rights under a properly executed debt instrument. She looked at him. Which is true. True isn't always sufficient, he said. It is when you're the one who gets to say it first and loudest. She turned to Diane. I want a press release drafted. The DeLuca Foundation announcing the appointment of a new executive director and an expansion of its debt restructuring initiative, a program through which the foundation acquires distressed debt instruments and restructures them with social benefit conditions. Legitimate, clean, documented. Diane looked at her. That program doesn't currently exist. It will exist by tomorrow morning when the press release goes out. Silence. That's not what your father intended the foundation for, Diane said, carefully. But she said it. Elena looked at her directly. No, it's what I intend it for. A beat. Can you build the documentation in 18 hours? Diane's jaw set. Yes. Then do it. Rossi was watching her with the expression she'd learned to read as recalculation. He was revising something in his assessment of her, and she couldn't tell yet which direction the revision was moving. She'd stopped trying to track that. She had too many other things to track. Enzo appeared in the doorway at 4 o'clock. He'd been in a meeting with the regional coordinator from the Western Division, a man named Falcone, who had been with Salvatore for 22 years, and who Enzo had described with characteristic understatement as someone who would require careful introduction. He looked at Elena and then at the room and then back at Elena. The Ashworth family's lead attorney sent a letter of inquiry to the primary intermediary holding company 40 minutes ago, he said. They're naming DeLuca. The room went very still. They traced it in 14 hours, Rossi said. He said it without inflection, just the fact. They had help, Enzo said. The word landed differently than the words before it. Elena looked up at him. Something in his face was wrong. Controlled, but wrong underneath the control, the way a wall looks right before it shows the crack. What do you mean? She said. Not a question. A demand. Enzo came into the room and closed the door. He stood at the head of the table and he did not sit down, which she had never seen him do. He always sat. The sitting was part of how he operated, the deliberate lowering that said, I am not a threat in this room. I am a resource. Standing meant something different. The forensic firm the Ashworths retained, he said. It was referred to them. Referred by whom? A pause that lasted long enough that she could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. By someone within the organization, Enzo said. Elena's hands were flat on the table. She could feel the grain of the wood under her palms, the slight roughness of it. She concentrated on that for exactly 1 second. Tell me, she said. The referral was traced this morning by Rossi's team. The communication, an encrypted message routed through a third-party server, originated from an internal account. The account belongs to Victor Lane. The name meant something. In 2 weeks, she'd absorbed names the way you absorb a new language when you're dropped into a country with no dictionary, by necessity, by context, by the weight other people put on them when they spoke. Victor Lane was Salvatore's chief financial architect. He had designed the beneficial ownership structures that concealed the estate's acquisitions. He had been with Salvatore for 16 years. He had not been in her orientation meetings. Enzo had explained his absence by saying he was managing a complex transaction in the European division and would be introduced when he returned. "Where is he now?" Elena said. "We don't know," Enzo said. "His phone went dark 6 hours ago. His apartment is empty. The car his office uses hasn't moved in 2 days." "He ran," Rossi said. "Flat. Or was moved," Enzo said. Elena looked at Enzo. "Who benefits from the Ashworths finding out early?" "Anyone who wants your position compromised before you've had time to consolidate it," Enzo said. "Anyone who wanted Salvatore's succession plan to fail. Anyone who had a preferred alternative for what happened to the estate." "Was there an alternative?" Elena said. "Another heir? Another plan?" Enzo's hands moved. The first time she'd seen him make an involuntary physical gesture, both hands coming together on the table surface and then separating. There were people who expected that Salvatore's death would result in a division of the estate among the senior captains, a collective leadership structure. Several of the regional heads had understandings, informal, not documented, but understood. Understandings with whom? With Salvatore, or so they believed. He paused. Salvatore made many commitments over many years that he never intended to keep. It was a management tool. The regional captains believed they had a claim on succession. When the will was filed naming you as sole heir, that belief was challenged. Elena stared at him. "You knew this?" "Yes." "When were you going to tell me?" "When you had enough foundation to manage it." She stood up. Not fast, controlled, deliberate, the way she stood up because she needed to be on her feet for what came next. "Enzo, how many of the captains are operating on the assumption that I'm temporary?" He looked at her steadily. "A majority." The word sat on the table between them like something that had been dropped from a height. How large a majority? "Of the 11 regional captains, I believe 4 are fully committed to the succession as Salvatore designed it. 3 are wait and see. 4 are resistant." "Is Falcone in the resistant group?" A pause. "Yes." She thought about the meeting Enzo had been in that afternoon. Falcone and Enzo in a room together for 2 hours while Rossi's team was tracking a leak that led back to Victor Lane, who had been managed by Enzo. She thought about the way Enzo had delivered the information about Lane, standing up, careful, the particular care of a man who is not sure what the other person in the room knows. "Were you in the meeting with Falcone when Lane's account sent the message?" she asked. Enzo's eyes didn't move. "Yes." "So you have an alibi." "Elena, I'm not accusing you of anything." She kept her voice level. "I'm mapping the timeline. You were with Falcone. Lane's account sent the message. Either Lane sent it before he went dark, or someone with access to his account sent it while he was already gone. Does Falcone have technical people?" A long pause. "Yes." "Could they access Lane's account?" "It's possible." "So the message could have been sent by Falcone's people using Lane's credentials after Lane was removed from the picture." She said, "Remove the way you say a word when you know what it means, and you're choosing to say the version with fewer syllables." Enzo heard it. His face went through something she couldn't fully track. "It's possible," he said again. His voice was quieter. "Where's Laney, Enzo?" "I told you, we don't—" "Where is he?" The silence this time had a different texture. Diane had her eyes on her laptop screen, which Elena recognized as the practiced look of a professional who has learned to not exist during certain conversations. Rossi was looking at the window. "I don't know for certain," Enzo said, "but if Falcone was involved—" He stopped. "Then Lane is dead," Elena said. Enzo said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She sat back down. She needed to sit because the thing that was happening in her chest, not fear, not grief, something more structural and more cold, the understanding that the situation she was in was significantly more dangerous than she had been told, needed somewhere to go that wasn't visible on her face. Victor Lane was probably dead. The Ashworths now knew the DeLuca name was behind the debt acquisition. 4 of 11 regional captains considered her temporary, and at least one of them was willing to use violence to enforce that assessment. She was 2 weeks into learning how to run an organization she'd never heard of 3 weeks ago, and the organization had a faction inside it that was actively working to destroy her before she got her footing. She breathed. "Call the 4 loyal captains," she said. "Tonight. Not a meeting. Individual calls from you framed as routine check-ins. I want to know their current positions on the Falcone situation without telling them what we know. I want their honest read." "And Falcone?" Rossi asked. "Nothing. Not yet. We don't move on Falcone until we understand the full shape of what he's built." She looked at Enzo. "Is there anything else you haven't told me because you were waiting for me to be ready?" He met her eyes. "Yes," he said. "Tell me now." He pulled out a chair and finally sat down. The action had a quality of concession to it, like something being put down that had been carried a long distance. "There is a provision in the estate documentation," he said. "A provision Salvatore did not include in the initial briefing materials I gave you. I was instructed, by Salvatore, in a recorded message, to disclose it only after you had demonstrated sufficient command of the operational situation to manage the implications." Elena waited. "The DeLuca estate includes a specific class of asset that does not appear in any of the financial documentation. Salvatore spent 20 years collecting intelligence material, records, evidence of transactions, relationships, and events involving individuals across multiple sectors: political, financial, law enforcement, corporate. The material is extensive and it is stored in 3 locations, 2 physical and 1 digital, the locations of which only I know." She looked at him. "What kind of evidence?" "The kind that ends careers," Enzo said, "and in some cases ends more than that." He paused. "Several of the individuals in those files are people the Ashworth family considers allies, people who have helped them maintain their position in this city for decades." The room was very quiet. "He built leverage," Elena said. "Not just financial, personal, political." "He believed that financial leverage was temporary," Enzo said. "People find ways around debt. They don't find ways around documentation of the things they've done when they believe no one was watching. And this material," she stopped, "is any of it illegally obtained?" "Define illegally obtained," Rossi said, which was not quite a joke and not quite not one. "Enzo. Some of it was obtained through means that would not survive judicial scrutiny," Enzo said. "Most of it was obtained through sources and methods that are aggressive but defensible. The distinction matters if you intend to use it through legal channels. If you intend other uses, I intend legal channels," Elena said. Flat. Final. He looked at her for a moment. "Then approximately 70% of the material is usable. The rest remains available as background." She absorbed this. "Who else knows this material exists?" "No one in the current organization, with the exception of myself. Lena knew it existed, but not the locations. The 3 custodians of the physical locations know they are custodians, but not the full contents." He paused. "And Falcone?" "Falcone knew Salvatore maintained leverage material. He did not know the specifics, but the fact of its existence is part of what makes your position contested. Whoever controls the intelligence archive controls the organization's most durable leverage." "And Falcone wants it," Elena said. "Falcone wants what controlling it would give him." She stood again. This time she went to the window, the way Enzo habitually did, and understood for the first time why. You could see the street below, the ordinary movement of the city, and it gave you something to look at while your mind worked that wasn't the faces of the people in the room. She had thought 10 days ago that her problem was Constance Ashworth's small smile and $63 million in callable debt. She had thought her problem was learning fast enough, earning loyalty in time, presenting the right face at the right moment. She had thought the danger was external, the Ashworths looking for who was pulling their strings. She had been wrong about the direction of the threat. The most immediate danger was here, inside this building, inside the organization her father had built and had believed was loyal, and which was in fact a contested structure with a faction actively working to remove her before she understood what removing meant. Her father had known this. He had known the captains would resist. He had known Falcone specifically. Enzo's careful pauses around Falcone's name had been there from the first day, she saw that now, was a problem. And he had built the intelligence archive as a counterweight, a structural deterrent, a reason for the resistant captains to hesitate before moving against whoever held it. The problem was that Salvatore had expected to have more time to transfer that deterrence to his successor. And Salvatore had been wrong about how much time he had, or had been wrong about Falcone's willingness to move fast, or both. She turned from the window. "I want to see the archive," she said. Enzo looked at her carefully. "I'd recommend waiting until—" "Enzo," she said it quietly. "I understand why my father built in delays. I understand the logic of staging information, but the situation has moved past the staging plan. Victor Lane is probably dead, and Falcone has already made a move, and I'm making decisions without the full picture, and that stops tonight." She paused. "I want to see the archive." A long silence. Enzo looked at Rossi. Rossi looked at the window. "Tonight," Enzo said finally. "Tonight." The facility was in a building in the warehouse district that presented as a document storage and management company, which was accurate as far as it went. They went at 9 p.m., Enzo driving himself in an unremarkable sedan rather than using any of the organization's regular vehicles, Elena in the passenger seat, Rossi following 3 blocks behind in a separate car. The protocol felt excessive until Elena thought about Victor Lane, and then it didn't feel excessive at all. The building was 4 stories, concrete block, fluorescent lighting in the lobby that made everything look forensic. A man at a security desk who stood when Enzo entered and looked at Elena without expression and then looked at Enzo. "She has access," Enzo said. "Permanent. Log it." The man logged it without comment. They went to the basement. The room was temperature-controlled and dry and looked nothing like what she'd expected. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just shelving units along 3 walls containing bankers' boxes, each labeled with a code she didn't know. And in the center of the room, a single table with 2 chairs and a laptop and an external drive. Enzo sat down at the laptop. He typed a sequence she couldn't see from her angle. The drive began to hum. "The digital index is organized by subject and by year," he said. "The physical files correspond to the index codes. I'll walk you through the organizational structure." She sat down across from him. "Show me the Ashworth file first." He pulled it up. She read. It took 40 minutes, and she didn't stop reading once. The Ashworth material was thorough, and it was old. Some of it went back 15 years, to transactions Richard had been involved in before he met Elena, before his mother had allowed the marriage she'd spent the subsequent decade dismantling. There were payments that weren't payments in any clean sense. There were relationships with city officials that produced outcomes for Ashworth properties. There were 2 incidents involving Richard personally that had been managed with money and NDAs and the specific efficiency of a family that had been buying its way out of consequences for 3 generations. None of it surprised her exactly. She had lived adjacent to this family for 12 years. She had felt the shape of these things even when she hadn't had evidence of them. What surprised her was the last document in the file. It was dated 11 months ago. It was a record of a meeting. Not a formal document, a transcribed conversation, the kind produced by surveillance, between Constance Ashworth and a man named Renner. The transcript was 16 pages. Elena read all of it. She sat for a moment when she was done. Then she looked at Enzo. "Who is Renner?" she asked. Enzo's expression had changed. He had been watching her read, and his face had gone through something she hadn't tracked because she'd been focused on the screen. "Thomas Renner," he said. "A private investigator. Retained by the Ashworth family approximately 18 months ago. For what purpose? Originally to document your activities during the divorce proceedings. Evidence collection. And then? Because there was clearly an and then. And then Constance Ashworth gave him a second assignment, Enzo said, to identify and document the person or entity she suspected was acquiring Ashworth debt. Elena looked at the screen again. She looked at a specific passage in the transcript, a passage she had read twice and then a third time to make sure she was reading it correctly. She knew, Elena said, before the forensic firm, before today. She knew someone was buying the paper. She looked at Enzo. She suspected DeLuca specifically. Yes. The transcript is 11 months old. Yes. Which means... She stopped. She worked it through, the timeline, the sequence of events, what the timeline meant about the sequence of causes. Which means when Constance Ashworth walked into that courtroom 3 weeks ago, when she looked at me across the room, she already knew. Enzo said nothing. She knew who my father was. She knew there was a DeLuca connection. She went ahead with the divorce and the settlement anyway. Elena's voice had gone very quiet. The particular quiet that isn't calm but is its opposite. Something past agitation, past anger. A place where the emotions have compressed to the point of being unrecognizable as emotions. Why? I've spent some time on that question, Enzo said. My conclusion is that Constance Ashworth believed Salvatore was dying and that without him, the DeLuca connection was a liability with no backing. She believed she could take the settlement, absorb the debt risk, and manage the fallout from whoever inherited the estate, because she believed whoever inherited would either not know the full picture or not be capable of using it. She gambled, Elena said. She made a calculation, Enzo said, based on everything she knew about you. Based on everything she knew about you. Elena sat with that. The woman who had spent 12 years watching Elena and concluding that what she saw was manageable. A woman who had been wrong about so many things, but had been right that she could manage Elena. Until 3 weeks ago, until 3 garbage bags on a courthouse steps, until a limousine across the street, and a man who was already dying and already decided. There's something else, Enzo said. She looked at him. The transcript, page 11, the second assignment Renner received. He reached across and scrolled to the page. After identifying the DeLuca connection, Constance authorized a third phase. Elena read page 11. The room was absolutely silent. She could hear the temperature control system cycling, the faint mechanical respiration of the archive around her. Renner had been retained not just to investigate. He had been retained to make contact. The transcript recorded Constance Ashworth instructing him to approach specific individuals within the DeLuca organization. The word she used was approach, which in context meant to find the people with grievances, the people who felt their position was precarious, the people who might consider their interests better served by a different outcome for the estate, and to explore whether those people could be cultivated. Elena thought about Victor Lane. She thought about the message traced back to Lane's account. She thought about Falcone and his 22 years of informal understandings with Salvatore and his belief that he had a claim on what Salvatore left behind. Constance Ashworth made contact with Falcone, Elena said. It wasn't a question. She could see the shape of it now. Enzo was very still. We believe so. We can't yet document the specific communication, but the timeline fits. She helped him. Elena's voice was flat, factual, moving through the logic because the logic was the only thing that felt stable right now. She approached someone inside the organization who already wanted me out, gave him intelligence about the estate's financial moves, helped him get to Lane. Presumably, Enzo said. And in exchange, Falcone's help in neutralizing the DeLuca debt position would protect her family's financial exposure. She stopped. Mutual benefit. The enemy of my enemy, Rossi said from behind her. She hadn't heard him come in. He was standing at the door of the archive room with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who has done the math and doesn't like the answer. How long have you known about Renner? Elena asked Enzo. A pause. I identified the Renner connection 4 days ago. 4 days. She had been sitting in conference rooms for 4 days learning financial instruments and foundation governance, while Enzo had been sitting across the table knowing that Constance Ashworth had been running an operation against the estate from the inside. She stood up from the chair. It It was a controlled movement, but it cost her something. "Why didn't you tell me 4 days ago?" she asked. "Because 4 days ago you didn't know enough about the internal structure to understand the implications," Enzo said. "I made a judgment call. That was my call to make. You weren't ready to smoke, Enzo." She turned and looked at him, and she saw him register something in her face that made him stop. "If you make that judgment again without my knowledge, I will restructure your role in this organization in ways neither of us will enjoy. Do you understand me?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that she thought afterward might have been the thing that was closest to what Salvatore De Luca had looked like when he was satisfied. "Yes," he said. "I understand you." She breathed. "All right." She looked around the archive. The boxes on the shelves, the indexed and documented weight of 30 years of a man's systematic collection of leverage. Her father's most durable weapon, sitting in bankers' boxes in a basement in the warehouse district, now hers. "I need everything you have on Falcone, and everything on Renner, tonight." "It'll take tonight, Enzo." She turned to Rossi. "I need a secure line that the organization's internal network doesn't touch. Clean phone, clean server, nothing Falcone's people could be monitoring." "I have that," Rossi said, "and I need to know who the 4 loyal captains are. Names, faces, history. Because tomorrow morning I'm going to start making calls, and by the end of tomorrow I need to know exactly what I'm standing on and what I'm not." She paused. "Falcone doesn't make another move while I'm building this picture. Can you slow him down without tipping him that we know?" Rossi thought for exactly 3 seconds. "There's a regulatory inspection scheduled for one of his shipping operations next week. I can move the timeline up. It won't stop him, but it'll distract him for 48 hours. Do it." She went back to the laptop and opened the Falcone file and started reading, and Enzo and Rossi moved around her in the careful orbit of people who have recalibrated their understanding of who is at the center of the room, and the archive breathed its mechanical breath around her, and she read. At 2 a.m, Rossi brought her coffee without being asked. She took it without looking up. At 3:15, she found the document that changed everything again. It was in a subfolder of the Falcone file, mislabeled or deliberately obscured, she couldn't tell which, titled with a code that matched nothing in the main index. She almost skipped it. She opened it because she was tired and methodical, and tired people are methodical in ways that sometimes serve them. It was a financial record, a series of wire transfers, old, going back 9 years. The transfers moved money through 3 intermediary accounts before landing in an account she didn't recognize, and the amounts were large enough that she sat up straight when she saw the figures, and she stared at the account number, and then she pulled up the estate's master financial index on the second window, and she ran the account number through it, and waited while the database searched, and then the name came up on the screen and she stopped breathing for a moment. The account belonged to Caruso and Associates. She looked at the name on the screen. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked across the archive room at Enzo Caruso, who had been her father's consigliere for 19 years, who had been the architect of the succession plan, who had been the first person to tell her about the estate and the first person she had trusted with everything she was learning, and she understood that she was sitting in a room alone with him in a building in the warehouse district at 3 a.m. with Rossi somewhere upstairs on a phone call, and the transfers in this file were 9 years old, and the amounts were very large, and the account was his, and she did not know, could not know yet, in this moment, whether she was looking at something Salvatore knew about and had made peace with, or something Salvatore had never found, or something so deeply embedded in the organization's structure that finding it now, like this, in the middle of everything else that was crumbling, meant that she was not standing where she thought she was standing at all. She didn't move for 40 seconds. She counted them. Not because she was calm, but because movement without a plan was the most dangerous thing she could do right now. In this room, at 3 a.m, with Enzo Caruso sitting 12 feet away from her, and a financial record on the screen that might mean he'd been stealing from her father for 9 years, or might mean something else entirely. And the difference between those two things was the difference between a man she could still use and a man who had been running her since the moment she walked through those frosted glass doors. On the count of 40, she closed the subfolder. She did it without hesitation, without changing her breathing, without any of the visible tells she'd been unconsciously cataloging in other people over the past 2 weeks and trying to eliminate in herself. She moved back to the main Falcone file and scrolled as if she'd simply been reading continuously, and she picked up a sentence near the bottom of a page about shipping manifests and read it with apparent attention. Enzo was watching her. She could feel it. Not paranoia, just the specific awareness of a room where one person is paying close attention to another. She did not look up. "The shipping disruption Rossi is setting up," she said. Her voice came out level. She was mildly surprised. "Will Falcone know it's not routine?" "He'll suspect," Enzo said. "He won't be able to prove it. Then he'll act faster." She looked up then, directly at Enzo, and watched his face with the new layer of attention she was now operating on. "Which means our 48 hours is probably 24. "Probably," he said. His face was what it always was. Careful, present, controlled. She looked for the thing that the financial record might mean, and she couldn't find it in his expression, which told her either he was clean or he was very good at this. She thought about Salvatore. 19 years. A man like her father would have known, surely would have known, if his closest advisor had been skimming. And if he'd known and kept Enzo anyway, that meant the transfers were something other than theft. A sanctioned arrangement, a payment for something specific, or a test, some elaborate trap she couldn't see the shape of yet. She needed time she didn't have. "I'm going to need an hour," she said. "Alone. I need to think through the captain sequencing." Enzo stood without comment. "I'll be upstairs." He picked up his coffee cup and went to the door and paused. "Elena." She looked at him. "Whatever you found in that subfolder, I can explain it." The air in the room changed. She looked at him for a moment. "What subfolder?" His expression didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. A recognition, and under it something that might have been respect or might have been relief, she couldn't tell which. "The one with the mislabeled index code," he said. "I know you found it. You stopped breathing for 11 seconds. He held her gaze. "I'll be upstairs when you're ready." He left. She sat in the silence of the archive for exactly 3 minutes, doing nothing. Then she pulled the subfolder back up and looked at the transfers again. And then she went upstairs. Enzo was in a small break room with his coffee and a legal pad and the expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific conversation for a long time and has decided he's glad it's finally arrived. She sat down across from him. "Talk," she said. "The transfers," he said. 9 years ago, Salvatore authorized a series of payments to an account held by a private entity I controlled. The purpose was to create a documented financial relationship between myself and an external account that could, under certain circumstances, be presented as evidence of embezzlement. She looked at him. "It was a protection mechanism," he said. "Salvatore's design. If I were ever taken, by law enforcement, by rivals, by anyone who wanted to use me as leverage against the organization, the existence of that documentation meant that any testimony I gave, any information I disclosed, would be immediately credible to implicate as motivated by personal financial gain." He paused. "A man who has been stealing from his employer has a motive to lie, to protect himself. That motive contaminates testimony." "He built you a frame," Elena said, "a pre-made alibi for contamination." "Yes, so that if I were ever in a position where someone was forcing me to talk, anything I said was pre-discredited." He held her gaze. "Salvatore knew about the account. He created it. The money was transferred back through a separate structure within 6 months. The net movement was 0. She thought about this. She thought about the specific kind of mind that designs a protection mechanism that looks, from the outside, exactly like proof of betrayal. "And you kept the documentation in the archive," she said. "Where I would eventually find it." "Yes." "Why?" "Because Salvatore told me to." Enzo set down his coffee. "He said that if his daughter was smart enough to find it and scared enough not to ask me about it, he'd made a mistake in his succession plan, and if she found it and asked, he wanted me to tell her exactly what I just told you." He paused. "He was still testing you from the grave." She sat with that for a moment. The particular quality of fury that comes from understanding you've been managed, even by someone who meant well, even by someone who is no longer alive to be held accountable for it. That's the last one, she said. The last test I didn't know I was taking. Enzo looked at her steadily. Yes. From now on, if there's something I need to know, you tell me. Not when you think I'm ready. Not after I find it myself. You tell me. Yes, he said. Again with that quality she'd first registered in the archive, something that looked like relief. Her phone vibrated. It was Rossi. She answered. We have a problem, he said. He didn't say it like someone who was surprised. He said it like someone who had been building toward this sentence for an hour. Falcone moved. Not the shipping inspection, something else. He called an emergency convocation of the captains, all 11, tomorrow evening. He sent the call through official organization channels, which he has the authority to do as senior regional captain, and he framed it as an operational security meeting, a pause. He's framing it as a response to what he's calling unauthorized actions by an unverified successor that have created legal exposure for the organization. Elena looked at the table. He's calling a vote, she said. Not formally, but effectively. He's going to walk into that room tomorrow with 10 other captains and present you as a liability and propose a collective leadership structure, and by the end of the night, he'll have enough of them to make your position untenable. Another pause. He also, and this is the part I need you to hear clearly, he sent a separate communication to the Ashworth family's attorney 2 hours ago. He offered to facilitate a resolution of the DeLuca debt position in exchange for the Ashworths dropping any legal investigation into the estate's beneficial ownership. The betrayal had a shape now, not just Falcone using the organization against her. Falcone using the organization to help the Ashworths escape, trading her leverage for his consolidation. Where's the convocation? She asked. The Meridian Club, private dining room, East Wing, 7 p.m. She looked at Enzo, who had heard enough of the call from 3 feet away to understand the outline. He was already looking at her with the expression of a man who has arrived at the same conclusion by a different route. I'll be there, she said. Elena, I'll be there, Rossi. She hung up. Enzo said, That's his ground. He chose it. I know. He'll have the room before you walk in. He's had weeks to work those relationships. You've had 2 weeks to build yours. I know. The 4 captains who are committed to the succession, they may not be enough to hold the room if Falcone has the momentum. I know. She stood up. What does he not have? Enzo was quiet for a moment. The archive, he said. He knows it exists. He doesn't know what's in it, and he doesn't know you've seen it. What's in the archive that touches the captains in his coalition? Enzo thought for exactly 4 seconds. Capretti, Western Shipping. There's documentation of a transaction 3 years ago that he has significant reason not to want disclosed. Markov, Eastern Financial Operations. There's material going back to a period before he joined the organization when his relationship with a particular federal task force was not entirely what he represented it to be. He paused. DeSantis, I would need to check. Check, she said. Now. And I need it documented, indexed, and portable by 6 a.m. She didn't sleep. She spent the hours between 4 and 6 a.m. in the archive with Diane, who had been called at 4:15 and had arrived at 4:45 without complaint and with a laptop and the specific expression of a woman who has understood that the situation has changed and has decided to be where the work is. They built the documentation package together. Not a weapon, not yet, just a set of clearly organized facts, verifiable and sourced, relating to 3 of the 4 captains in Falcone's expected coalition. Information that each of those men would recognize immediately as coming from a source that had been watching them for years. Information that would tell them, without a word being said directly, that the woman walking into that room tonight knew things that Falcone could not protect them from. At 6 a.m., she showered in the executive bathroom on the 3rd floor, changed into clothes that Vita had arranged to have delivered. This was the part of working with people who had been managing Salvatore's world for decades, that they anticipated certain categories of need without being asked, and sat in her office with coffee and the outline of what she was going to do at 7 p.m. and what she was going to need to hold the room. Rossi came in at 7:30. He looked like a man who had also not slept, which she found oddly steadying. "The loyal four are confirmed," he said. "Benedetti, Sato, Holm, and Price. They know about the convocation. They're cautious." Meaning? Meaning they're committed to the succession in principle, but they're not sure you can hold the room against Falcone in person, and they're not going to expose themselves politically if the outcome is uncertain. "Then I need to make the outcome certain before 7 p.m. She looked at him. "Get me Benedetti. Phone? Not in person. I want to talk to him directly." Rossi looked at her for a moment. "He doesn't talk to people he hasn't met." "Then tell him he's about to make an exception." The call with Benedetti lasted 11 minutes. He was a man in his 60s with a voice that sounded like gravel being moved in a metal drum, and the kind of silence between sentences that meant he was deciding rather than thinking. The decision was already forming. The silence was just the space it took to harden. She told him what she knew. Not everything. Not the Enzo situation, not the full archive, not more than he needed to calibrate his own position. She told him about Falcone and Renner and Constance Ashworth and the wire that had passed through Lane's account. She told him what Falcone was trading and to whom. When she was done, there was a silence that lasted long enough that she checked her phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "He's selling to the Ashworths," Benedetti said finally. Not a question, just a man making sure he'd heard correctly. "Yes." Another silence. Salvatore would have... He stopped himself. "I'm not Salvatore," Elena said, "but I know what's in the archive going back 22 years, and I know what Falcone has done in those years that he cannot afford to have documented, and I know that any collective leadership structure Falcone proposes tomorrow night will have a very short and very uncomfortable lifespan for everyone associated with it." She paused. "Or we walk into that room tonight and we end this tonight. Your choice, Mr. Benedetti." The silence this time was shorter. "I'll be there," he said. She made the same call to Sato and to Holm. Price she asked Enzo to handle directly, because Price and Enzo had a 20-year relationship, and some calls needed a voice attached to a history. By 3 p.m., she was in the car being driven to the Meridian Club for a preliminary walkthrough of the room, a thing Vita had arranged with the club's management, framed as a foundation site visit for a future event, which gave them 40 minutes in the East Wing private dining room to understand the physical geography of the evening. The room was long and narrow, with a table that seated 14 and wall sconces, and the particular airless formality of a space designed to make people feel that what happens here is serious. She walked the length of it twice. She stood at the head of the table, which was where Falcone would position himself, having called the meeting, and looked at the 12 chairs arrayed in front of her and thought about the order of the room. Then she walked to the side entrance, the one that staff used, and stood there for a moment. "I won't come in the main door," she told Vita. Vita looked at her. "You'll come in the staff entrance." "I'll come in after they're seated, after Falcone has started." She looked at the room. "He needs to have the room before I take it from him." Vita was quiet for a moment. She was a woman who had been running the Foundation's public face for 6 years and who had a specific relationship with drama. She understood it, she managed it, she was very good at determining when it was useful and when it was wasteful. "That's a risk," she said. "Everything tonight is a risk." Elena looked at her. What would Salvatore have done? "Salvatore wouldn't have been in this position," Vita said, without cruelty, just fact. "He would have had Falcone managed 3 months ago." "I know, I didn't have 3 months." She looked at the room one more time. "I have tonight." They arrived at the Meridian Club at 6:40. Falcone's people were already there. She clocked 2 men in the lobby who were not club staff and not the kind of men who came to the Meridian Club for dinner, standing in positions that covered the entrance and the corridor to the East Wing. Security. His people, not hers. Rossi was beside her. He saw them too. His jaw moved once and then was still. "Side door," she said quietly. They went around. She waited in a small antechamber off the staff corridor at 6:58, Rossi on one side of her and Enzo on the other, and she could hear through the door the sound of the room filling. Chairs, the low register of men's voices, the particular acoustic quality of a room with 14 people and a high ceiling. She couldn't make out words. She didn't need to. She could hear the texture of it. Falcone's voice, which she'd heard only in recordings but recognized from its cadence, moving through the room with the ease of a man who believes the room is already his. She breathed. Her hands were completely still. At 7:03, when Falcone's voice had risen to the particular pitch of a man making a case, she opened the door and walked in. The room snapped to silence the way a room does when something unexpected enters it. Every face turned. She had a moment, a single beat of complete attention. The whole room focused, and she used it the way you use a second when you know exactly what to do with it. She didn't stop, didn't hesitate, didn't acknowledge the surprise. She walked the length of the room to the chair at the far end, not the head, the foot, the opposite end from Falcone, and she sat down and put her hands flat on the table and looked at him. Falcone was a large man in his late 50s, dark-suited, with the kind of face that looks carved rather than grown, and eyes that had been calculating their whole life. He looked at her with an expression that contained several things at once: surprise, which he covered fast, and anger, which he covered slower, and underneath both of them something she recognized from her time in courtrooms: the recalculation of a man who had prepared for a specific scenario and is now managing the gap between preparation and reality. "Ms. Vaughn," he said. The room was very quiet. "This is an internal organizational meeting. You weren't—" "I know," she said. "I came anyway." A beat. Someone at the table shifted in their chair. "You've been in this organization for 2 weeks," Falcone said. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the effort. "You don't have the standing to—" "I have the archive," Elena said. The room changed. Not visibly. No one moved. No one made a sound. But she felt it, the change in the air, the way 10 men who had spent their careers in an organization that ran on leverage suddenly recalibrated the cost structure of the next 60 seconds. Falcone's jaw tightened. "I also have the Renner communications," she said. "The ones that document your arrangement with Constance Ashworth, the timeline of your contact with her firm, the terms you offered in exchange for assistance with the estate investigation." She looked at him steadily across the length of the table. "And I have the transfer records for the 3 accounts you used to move the facilitation payment after Lane disappeared." The silence in the room was absolute. "That's a significant accusation," Falcone said. His voice had gone very quiet. The quiet of a man who is deciding how far he's willing to go, right now, in front of 10 witnesses. "It's a documented fact," Elena said. "The question isn't whether it's true. The question is what you want to happen next." "You're threatening me," Falcone said. "I'm telling you what I know," she said. "What happens with what I know is still being determined." Falcone looked at the men around the table. She watched him do it. The inventory, the calculation, the rapid assessment of who was where. She watched him look at Benedetti and find something in Benedetti's face that stopped him. She watched him look at Sato and find the same thing. She watched him understand that the room he thought he'd built was not the room he was sitting in. His hands came together on the table. "You've been here 2 weeks," he said again. Quieter now. Almost to himself. "I know," she said. "It's been a busy 2 weeks." Capretti, who was seated 3 chairs to Falcone's left, and who had spent the past 2 minutes with the stillness of a man doing very fast arithmetic, said, "The archive material you mentioned, how specific is the documentation?" Elena looked at him. "Specific enough," she said. "Verifiable, sourced, dated." She paused. "I don't intend to use it. I intend to hold it. That's a different thing." Capretti looked at Falcone, then at his hands, then at Elena. "What do you intend?" Falcone said. The anger was gone now. What remained was something harder and colder and more honest. He was a man who had lost the room and knew it and was now working out the terms. "The same thing my father intended," Elena said. "A functioning organization, a successor who has the information and the relationships to hold it together." She looked at the table set. All of them, not just Falcone, the sweep of it deliberate. Salvatore built something that has lasted 40 years. He built it through leverage and loyalty and the understanding that both of those things are more durable than force. She paused. I'm not here to destroy what he built. I'm here to run it. The question for every person in this room is whether you want to be part of what comes next or part of what gets resolved tonight. Markov spoke. He was on Falcone's side of the table, but his voice didn't have Falcone's texture in it, the texture of someone who had made a specific bet and was watching it fail. The Ashworth situation, he said. What's your position? The debt instruments stand, Elena said. The legal timeline proceeds. No external resolution negotiated through back channels. She looked at Falcone when she said back channels. He held her gaze. And the collective leadership proposal, DeSantis said, from Falcone's coalition, but asking the question, which meant the coalition was already loosening at the seams. You're declining it. There's no legitimate basis for it, Elena said. The will is filed. The estate is documented. The succession is legal and complete. She paused. But I understand that succession on paper and succession in practice are different things. So here's what I'm offering. Each of you keeps your regional position. Your authority in your division is unchanged. I'm not restructuring the organization. I'm not replacing the people my father trusted. What I'm asking for is what my father asked for from every one of you at the beginning. A chance to prove that the person at the head of the table can do the job. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Benedetti said, That's reasonable. He said it simply, without inflection, the way a man says something when the decision has already been made and he's just closing the sentence. Sato said nothing, but he moved. A small adjustment in his posture, a settling, the physical grammar of a man who has decided he's staying. One by one, in the particular silence of a room where the outcome is being registered without being spoken, the balance shifted. Falcone sat very still through all of it. When it was done, when the room had moved and there was no longer any version of the evening where he walked out with what he'd come for, he looked at Elena across the length of the table, and his expression had something in it she hadn't seen on his face before. Not anger, not calculation, something older. Your father, he said. He was a patient man. Yes, Elena said. You're not patient. No, she said. I'm not. She held his gaze. But I'm accurate, and right now that's enough. His jaw moved, his hands, still flat on the table, pressed down once and then lifted, the gesture of a man putting something down. What do you want from me? He said. She looked at him for a long moment. The room was absolutely still, 10 men watching the space between two people at opposite ends of a table, the specific gravity of it. I want to know about Lane, she said. His face went through something. Lane is alive or not? She said. A pause that lasted long enough to be its own answer. Not, Falcone said. The word landed in the room and nobody moved. Who gave the order? She asked. Her voice was completely flat. The order was given, he said, because Lane was going to talk. He'd made contact with, He stopped, looked at the table. He was going to take the information he had about the debt acquisition to the Ashworth forensic firm directly, not through me, directly. He was working both sides, Elena said. He was afraid, Falcone said. He thought the succession was going to destabilize the organization, and he was trying to position himself with whoever came out on top. A pause. He miscalculated. And you decided to resolve his miscalculation, Elena said. I resolved a security problem, Falcone said. The old voice coming back, just briefly, the voice of a man who has made decisions like this before and has a language for them. The way such problems have always been resolved in this organization. That's not a decision that was yours to make, Elena said. Not unilaterally, not without authorization from the head of the organization. There was no head of the organization, Falcone said. There was a woman who had been here 2 weeks and didn't know what she didn't know. There's a head of the organization, Elena said. There has been since the will was filed. She looked at him steadily. I'm going to give you one option, Falcone. 1. You step back from the senior captain role. You retain your regional position with reduced scope. You provide full documentation of every communication with the Ashworth family and with Renner and every detail of the Lane situation. And in exchange, what's in the archive stays in the archive. Falcone looked at her. That's not, he started. It's the only option on the table, she said. The alternative is that I walk out of this room and make 3 calls, and by morning, you're dealing with the full weight of everything I have documented in every venue simultaneously. She paused. I don't want to do that. I want an organization that functions. But I will do it if the alternative is sitting in this room next month having this same conversation. The silence stretched. Falcone looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He looked at the faces around him and found nothing to work with. The room had moved, and the room stayed moved, and there was no version of the next 10 seconds where that changed. One condition, he said. She waited. The Lane situation doesn't go outside this room, he said. What happened to him? It stays internal. Elena looked at him for a long time. She thought about Victor Lane, who had been afraid and had made bad decisions out of fear, who had tried to hedge and had been wrong about which direction to hedge toward. She thought about what justice meant in a room like this one, in an organization like this one, whether the version of justice available here was the only version or just the most immediate one. That's not my only consideration, she said carefully, but it's one I'll hold for now. She met his eyes. If there's anything else, anything that comes to light about what happened, that offer expires. He nodded once. She looked at the room, all of them. Then we're done here tonight, she said. She stood up, and the room stood with her. Not all of them, not Falcone, but enough of them, the specific number that meant the thing had shifted and stayed shifted. She looked at Benedetti, at Sato, at the faces of men who had spent their careers calculating outcomes and had just watched someone walk into a room that wasn't hers and walk out with everything in it. She went to the side door. Rossi fell in beside her. Enzo 3 steps behind. In the corridor, with the door closed behind them and the sound of the room beginning to exhale back into noise, Rossi said quietly, Falcone. I know, she said. She kept walking. He's not done. I know that too. She reached the side exit and pushed it open, and the night air hit her face, cold and real after the airless pressure of the room. She stood on the service steps for a moment and breathed. Her hands were shaking. She noticed it now, the adrenaline burning off, her body finally registering what she'd spent the last 3 hours not allowing it to register. She pressed both palms flat against her thighs and breathed until the shaking stopped. Tomorrow the Ashworth debt notice would be processing. Tomorrow Falcone would be calculating whether the deal he'd just accepted was one he could live with. Tomorrow there were 11 captains who had watched her take a room and were now in the process of updating their assessment of what the DeLuca succession actually meant. But tonight, standing on a service step outside the Meridian Club with the city moving indifferently around her, she let herself have 30 seconds of the specific exhaustion of someone who has been running on adrenaline and certainty and sheer forward momentum for 2 weeks and has just spent it all in one room. 30 seconds. Then she stepped down onto the sidewalk and her phone buzzed, and she looked at the screen, and the name on it was one she hadn't seen before. The name belonged to one of Falcone's people, a name Rossi had given her 3 days ago as someone to watch. And the message was 4 words that made the 30 seconds of exhaustion evaporate instantly and replace itself with something cold and exact and very focused. The message said, Ashworth called the media. She looked at the screen. She looked at Rossi. He was already reading over her shoulder, and his face had gone to the particular stillness of a man who understands that the situation he thought was resolving has just opened a new and significantly more complicated front, because Constance Ashworth, who had spent 12 years as the smartest person in every room she'd ever been in, who had built a family empire on the specific understanding that public narrative was the most durable form of power, had just done what people like her always did when they felt the floor going out from under them. She'd gone to the press, and whatever she'd given them was going to be on the morning news, and Elena DeLuca, who had existed publicly as nobody for 34 years, was about. The message was 4 words, and it rewrote the next 12 hours completely. Elena stood on the service steps with the cold air on her face and her phone in her hand, and she read it twice. Not because she'd misunderstood it the first time, but because the second reading was the reading where you accept what the first reading told you. Ashworth called the media. What did she give them? She asked. She directed it at Rossi, but she was already dialing Vita. Don't know yet, Rossi said. He had his own phone out. Give me 3 minutes? Vita picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake and watching, which meant she'd already heard something. I know, Vita said before Elena could speak. I got a call from a contact at the Tribune 20 minutes ago. They're running a piece in the morning edition. Digital version drops at 6 a.m. What's the angle? DeLuca estate named as predatory creditor in Ashworth Holdings dispute. Anonymous sources claiming the estate has been engaged in a systematic and coordinated campaign to acquire and weaponize the debts of a prominent local business family using... Vita paused, and Elena could hear paper or a screen being consulted. Using legally questionable offshore structures and the resources of what sources describe as a criminal organization operating under the cover of a charitable foundation. The specific cold that moved through Elena's chest was not surprise. It was the recognition of a move she should have anticipated and hadn't given enough weight to, because she'd been so focused on the internal threat, Falcone, the captains, the archive, that she'd underestimated the speed at which Constance Ashworth would go external when she felt the walls moving. Criminal organization, Elena said. Yes. Does the piece name me specifically? It names Elena von DeLuca as the newly identified heir to the DeLuca estate, with a biographical sketch that includes the divorce proceedings, the courthouse appearance 3 weeks ago, and another pause. A characterization of Salvatore DeLuca's business history that is, let's say, selectively sourced. How selectively? It doesn't use the word mafia, Vita said. It doesn't have to. Elena looked at the city around her. The ordinary dark of a Tuesday night, traffic and lit windows and people moving through their lives without knowing that somewhere a woman was standing on a service step working out how to manage the next 8 hours before 6 a.m. turned them into a different kind of problem. Can we kill the piece? She asked. No, Vita said flatly. Not at this point. The Tribune won't spike it. It's a legitimate creditor dispute. The public interest angle is defensible, and they've been sitting on the DeLuca name since this afternoon. Counter-narrative? We have until 6 a.m. to place something. If the Foundation's public affairs team can get a statement to 3 or 4 outlets before the Tribune piece drops, we can shape the framing before it sets. A pause. But, Elena, the statement has to be from you, personally, not from the Foundation, not from an attorney, you. She thought about 34 years of deliberate invisibility. Her father's architecture of disappearance, the care he had taken to keep her outside the range of exactly this kind of exposure. She thought about what it meant to put her face and her name on a public statement at 6 in the morning in response to a newspaper piece that was going to call her father a criminal and call her his instrument. She thought about 3 garbage bags on a courthouse steps. Draft the statement, she said. I'll review it in an hour. And Vita, don't soften it. I want it direct. She hung up. Rossi was still on his phone. Enzo had come down the service steps and was standing beside her on the sidewalk with his coat collar up against the cold. And he looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as his most honest one. Not the careful, controlled face he wore in rooms, but the face that appeared in corridors and on sidewalks at 3 in the morning when there was no performance required. How bad? He asked. Bad enough. She started walking. Not to the car. Just walking, the way she'd learned she needed to do when her mind was working fast, the movement giving the thinking somewhere to go. She's been sitting on this move the whole time. She wasn't trying to stop us. She was letting us build the case, and then she was going to reframe it publicly as predatory conduct. She paused. She's been playing a longer game than I gave her credit for. She's been playing this game for 50 years, Enzo said. He kept pace with her. She didn't build what she built by being slow. No. Elena stopped at the corner. The debt notice. The covenant breach. How solid is our legal position? Entirely solid, Enzo said. The documentation is clean. The breach is documented. The instruments are legitimate. Everything we've done is legally defensible. But legally defensible and publicly defensible are 2 different things. Yes. She looked at the traffic light changing at the empty intersection, green to yellow to red, cycling through for nobody. What do people do? She said slowly. When a creditor comes after them and they can't fight the legal position, They fight the creditor's character. They make it about who is doing the collecting rather than what the underlying debt is. Constance Ashworth has been making things about character for 50 years, Enzo said. It works. It works when nobody fights back on the same ground. She turned to him. I need the Renner documentation, the communications between Constance and Falcone's people. I need it clean. I need it sourced. And I need it in a format that a newspaper editor can read in 20 minutes and understand. Enzo looked at her. You're going to give it to the press. I'm going to give it to the right press, yes. She held his gaze. She went public. She made this a public conversation. So we have a public conversation. She paused. Can you have the Renner material formatted and verified in the next 2 hours? He thought for exactly 2 seconds. Yes. Then let's go. She worked through the night with the specific, merciless efficiency of someone who has gone past the point where fatigue registers as anything other than background noise. Vita drafted, and Elena rewrote. And Vita drafted again. The statement went through 4 versions in 90 minutes. The final version was 3 paragraphs. It was direct, it was specific, and it was signed with both names. Elena Von DeLuca, Executive Director, DeLuca Foundation. The Renner documentation, the communications, the timeline, the record of Constance Ashworth's operation to cultivate internal dissent within the estate's organization, went to 2 journalists simultaneously at 4:30 a.m., not the Tribune. A financial investigative reporter at a national outlet who had been covering private credit markets for 11 years, and a local reporter who covered city politics and had a history with the Ashworth family's municipal relationships that gave the material a specific context she would understand immediately. At 5:15, Elena's phone rang. The number was Constance Ashworth's personal attorney. She stared at it for a moment and then answered. Ms. Vaughn? The attorney's name was Prescott, and he had the voice of a man who had been woken up and was managing it with professional grace. My client would like to request a brief conversation. Your client went to the Tribune at 10 o'clock last night, Elena said. If she wanted a conversation, that was the time to want one. The situation has evolved. Yes, Elena said. It has. Ms. Ashworth can reach me through the Foundation's Public Affairs office during business hours. She paused. Tell her the Renner documentation has been provided to journalists who will be calling her for comment beginning at approximately 7 a.m. A silence. Ms. Vaughn, that material, its provenance is entirely defensible, Elena said. Have a good morning, Mr. Prescott. She hung up. Rossi from across the room. How did that feel? She thought about it for a moment. Like closing a door, she said. The Tribune piece ran at 6 a.m. as promised. By 6:30, the national outlet had posted its own piece, which ran the Renner story alongside the debt dispute and framed the Ashworth family's approach to the creditor situation in a context that Constance could not have anticipated when she'd made her call to the Tribune the night before. By 8 a.m., the 2 stories were sitting side by side in the city's news ecosystem, and the narrative that Constance had tried to establish, predatory creditor, criminal organization, helpless local family, was competing with a different narrative. Prominent family orchestrates internal sabotage of creditors' operations while publicly crying victimhood. It wasn't clean. Nothing was clean. Elena sat in her office at 8:15 with the coverage spread across her laptop screen and understood that clean was not what this was going to be. There would be weeks of follow-up stories, legal statements, public positioning. The DeLuca name was now in the press in a way it hadn't been in 40 years, attached to her name, attached to the Foundation's name. Some of that would be managed, some of it wouldn't, but Constance Ashworth's move had failed. The narrative hadn't set the way she'd planned, and in the specific language of the kind of power Constance understood best, a failed move was not a recoverable position. Prescott called again at 9. This time the tone was different. My client would like to discuss a restructuring of the outstanding debt instruments, he said. She's prepared to enter into good faith negotiations regarding repayment terms, and there's a DeLuca Foundation program, Elena said, a debt restructuring initiative. Public benefit conditions apply. I'll have our team send the framework documents. She paused. The conditions are not negotiable. What are the conditions? A portion of the restructured obligation, 15%, is permanently redirected to fund programs serving women in economic distress. housing, legal support, career re-entry. The foundation administers the funds. The Ashworth family has no operational control over the programs. She paused. In exchange, the debt timeline is extended, the interest terms are reduced to market rate, and we do not pursue the enforcement remedies available to us under the current instruments. A very long silence. My client will need to review. Your client has 72 hours, Elena said. After that, the covenant breach notice proceeds on its current timeline. She hung up. She looked at the wall for a moment, then she put her head back and closed her eyes. She thought about Constance Ashworth sitting in some room in that family's house on a Tuesday morning with the news coverage on a screen in front of her, reading the story she'd tried to write about the woman she'd thrown away, and finding instead a story she didn't recognize about a name she should have been more careful with. She thought about whether what she felt about that was satisfaction, and concluded that it was something more complicated and less clean than satisfaction. The specific emotion of someone who has fought for something that mattered and is not yet sure what the fighting cost. She thought about Richard. Richard was a secondary problem, and she'd known that from the beginning. He was the vehicle Constance had used, not the engine. He had sat in that courtroom in his good suit and not looked at her, and he had done what Constance's sons did, which was to let their mother run the field and take the credit or the consequences. She didn't hate him. She had stopped hating him somewhere around day 4 of sitting in conference rooms learning about callable debt instruments, when she'd understood that hating Richard was spending emotional capital on something that wasn't actually the problem. The problem had been the structure, the assumption that she was manageable, the specific and long-practiced confidence of a family that had been buying and discarding people for 3 generations and had always found it to be cost-effective. That assumption was now documented in 2 national news stories and a set of foundation program conditions that would redirect Ashworth money to women who needed it for as long as the debt instrument was active. Rossi knocked on the door at 10:30. "Falcone," he said. She looked at him. He submitted the documentation this morning. Everything. The Renner communications, the Lane situation, the Ashworth contact. All of it. Rossi came in and closed the door. It's thorough. She absorbed this. He moved fast. He's a man who knows when the math has changed, Rossi said. He sat down across from her, which he rarely did without being asked, and she registered the shift, saw the small territorial adjustment that meant something in how he understood the room. He's requesting confirmation that the archive material stays internal. She looked at the desk, at her hands on the desk, at the city outside the window, ordinary and unaware. The Lane situation, she said. Yes. She thought about Victor Lane, who had been afraid and had been wrong about which direction to run, and who was gone now in the specific and irreversible way of people who make the wrong calculation in a world where wrong calculations carry that price. She thought about what she could do with what Falcone had documented. She thought about what doing it would cost and what not doing it would cost, and she understood that she was sitting in the middle of a question that had no clean answer, that this was, in fact, the question. Not the Ashworths, not the press, not the captains. This. The Lane documentation goes into the archive, she said finally. Sealed. Under my access only. She looked at Rossi. If anything like this happens again, any decision of that magnitude made without authorization, the seal comes off and we deal with the consequences regardless of cost. Falcone understands that? He understands it, Rossi said. Make sure he does, not the implication, the direct statement. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. And Rossi, I want a protocol established for decisions of that kind. Authority levels, authorization requirements, documentation. I don't want there to be ambiguity about what requires my direct approval. I'll have a draft to you by end of week. Good. She looked at him. How are the captains? Settled, he said. Mostly. Benedetti called Enzo this morning. Said to tell you. He paused, working through the phrasing as if he was being careful to get it right. He said to tell you that Salvatore picked better than he knew. Something moved in her chest. She looked out the window. Okay, she said. Quiet. Okay. Rossi left. She sat alone in the office for a few minutes. Then she opened the bottom drawer of the desk and took out the small leather-bound notebook that had belonged to her mother, the one she'd grabbed from the garbage bag in the hotel room on that first night, the one that had traveled from the Holiday Inn on Fletcher Street to the Hollander building in her coat pocket and had been sitting in this drawer for 2 weeks because she hadn't been able to make herself open it. She put it on the desk in front of her. The cover was soft from years of handling. Her mother's initials were pressed into the bottom right corner, small and precise, the kind of embossing that's done to last. She opened it. The first page was a date, 26 years ago, when Elena was 8. Her mother's handwriting, which she'd always found almost painful to look at because it was so completely itself, the particular slant and weight that was only ever one person's. A short entry about an ordinary day, school pickup, a grocery run, dinner. Elena making up a song at the table and singing it to the dog they'd had then. A big yellow animal named George who'd been her companion for 4 years before a fast-moving car on Birch Street had ended that. She read it. She turned the page. The notebook ran for 6 years. She read it over the next 2 hours. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to understand that her mother had known more than Elena had ever guessed. Not the specific operational details, the estate, the captains, the archive, but the shape of things, the general geography of the man she'd agreed to disappear from and what his disappearance had cost both of them. There were entries that mentioned him without naming him, references to a conversation, to a letter, to a wire transfer that arrived every quarter without fail, which her mother acknowledged in a single line once a year with the specific emotional economy of a woman who had worked out how to hold a complicated thing without letting it crush her. There was one entry, dated when Elena was 12, the year of the photograph, that was different from the others, longer, more unsettled. Her mother had found the photograph where Elena had put it back, in a different box, and had understood that Elena had been looking. She wrote, "I don't know how to tell her. I don't know what the right amount of truth is. I have been choosing safety over truth for 12 years, and I am no longer entirely certain they were the right choices, only that they were choices I could live with, which is perhaps the best that any of us can say." Elena sat with that for a long time. She thought about choices you make that you can live with. She thought about her father in a limousine across a rainy street, watching and not crossing. She thought about her mother in a kitchen, stopping mid-sentence when a child appeared in the doorway. She thought about 34 years of love expressed as absence, as infrastructure, as banker's boxes in a climate-controlled basement. And she thought about whether that love counted, whether it was real love, or just the intention of love organized into a shape that looked like love from a certain angle. She decided that this was not a question with an answer, that it was one of the questions that stays open, that you carry rather than resolve, and that the carrying was its own form of answer. She closed the notebook. The call she'd been putting off came at 2 in the afternoon. She made it herself, which was not the way Enzo or Rossi would have handled it, but she'd decided 2 days ago that this one was hers. She dialed the number for Marcus Webb. He answered on the third ring with the careful voice of a man who has been following the news coverage and has a great many questions and is trying to decide which one to lead with. "Elena," he said. "I wanted to call you directly," she said. "You've seen the coverage." "I have." A pause. "I have to ask." "I know what you have to ask," she said. "The divorce judgment stands. I'm not challenging it. That's not what this is." A silence. "You had access to the resources you apparently have access to during the proceedings," he said carefully. "The attorneys on their side. The estate was in a transitional period," she said. "The resources weren't available to me at the time of the proceedings in any operational sense. That's a legal distinction that matters, and it's accurate." She paused. "Marcus, I called to tell you that the Ashworth family is entering into a restructuring arrangement with the estate. The outcome of that arrangement will include certain public commitments that are not negotiable. I wanted you to hear it from me before you read it somewhere else." "What kind of commitments?" "The kind that use their money to help people they would have preferred to keep ignoring," she said. A long pause. "That's not exactly what I would have predicted as an outcome." "No," she said. "It's not what I predicted either." She looked at the window. "But it's what I decided. And I wanted you to know that the deciding was mine." She could hear him processing this, the specific quality of a man recalibrating something. "Are you all right?" he asked finally. Not professionally, just the question. She considered it honestly. I'm tired, she said, and I have about 6 months of work to get functional before I can start thinking past it. But yes. She paused. I'm all right. The formal meeting with the Ashworth family happened on a Thursday morning, 3 days later, in a conference room at the Hollander building. Prescott arrived with 2 associates and a carefully neutral expression. Constance Ashworth did not come. Elena noticed the absence and let it be what it was. She had not expected Constance. She had not needed Constance. She needed Prescott to have the authority to sign, which he did, and the rest of it, the old woman's pride, the decision not to sit across a table from the woman she'd tried to discard, was between Constance and whatever she was becoming in the wake of decisions she couldn't take back. They worked through the document over 2 hours. It was detailed, and it was specific. The debt instruments were restructured. The repayment timeline was extended with revised terms. The 15% diversion to foundation-administered programs was written into the agreement with enforcement mechanisms that had teeth. Prescott pushed back on 3 provisions. Elena held 2 and modified 1. It was negotiation, professional and focused, without heat on either side, the heat having been used up already in other rooms at other hours. When Prescott signed, he looked at her across the table with an expression that had something in it she hadn't seen from anyone connected to that family in 12 years. For what it's worth, he said. He stopped, started again. My client underestimated you from the beginning. I want to say that I believe she knows that now. Elena looked at him steadily. Tell her the programs start accepting applications next month, she said, and that the name of the first one is the Vaughn Initiative. She paused. After my mother. Prescott's expression did something small and then went back to neutral. He nodded once. He gathered his papers and left. That evening, Elena was alone in the office when Enzo came in with a package. A sealed envelope, thick, with her name on it in handwriting she didn't recognize and then did recognize, had seen in one photograph once, pressed into a courier pouch that had been left with the estate's notary 6 months before Salvatore died, to be opened after the succession was complete. He'd known, even then, what complete meant, what it would require. She held the envelope for a moment. Enzo stood in the doorway. I'll be downstairs, he said. He left. She opened it. There was no letter. There was a USB drive and a single index card with a handwritten note that said, "The password is your mother's name." She found a laptop and plugged in the drive and entered the password, Claire. And there was one file. A video, 41 minutes. She sat in the empty office with the city going dark outside the window and pressed play. He was sitting at a desk she didn't recognize. Behind him, a wall of books and nothing else. No identifying features, no window, the specific neutrality of a man who has thought about what he wants the frame to contain and has chosen blankness. He was wearing a dark suit without a tie. He looked like the photograph she'd found when she was 12. The same structure to his face, the same quality of stillness, but older and sick in a way the photograph hadn't been. The yellowish undertone in his skin, the careful way he held his posture, as if it required attention. He looked at the camera for a moment before speaking, long enough that she understood he was working out how to begin, which told her something about him that the 41 minutes confirmed. He was a man who had been certain about almost everything in his life and was not certain about this. I don't know what to call you, he said. His voice was rougher than she'd expected, lower, with an accent that was almost entirely absent but surfaced in certain vowels. I've written that sentence in different ways, and they all have the same problem, which is that I don't have the right to most of the words I want to use. He paused. So I'll just start and let you decide what to do with it. He talked for 41 minutes. He talked about her mother. He talked about the decision, not as an excuse, not as a justification, but as a thing he had done and had understood the cost of when he made it, and had carried the full weight of every day since. He talked about the monitoring, the quarterly wire transfers, the graduated education program he'd funded under her mother's name at the school Elena had attended, which she'd received as a scholarship and which she now understood had never been a scholarship. He talked about the divorce, which he'd seen coming before Elena had, and the cold, specific rage that had moved through him watching the Ashworths work, and the decision to accelerate the succession plan when the oncologist's numbers had made clear that the timeline he'd been planning around no longer existed. He talked about Enzo. He talked about the archive and the transfers and the frame he'd built into the documentation, which he explained with a kind of spare precision that told her he'd known she would find it and had wanted her to find it in the right sequence. He talked about Falcone with a directness that said he'd known Falcone was a problem and had chosen to leave it as a problem. She would have to solve herself, because there are things that cannot be handed to a successor already solved, that must be faced and worked through in order to become the kind of person who can hold what they're being given. She understood, listening, that he had engineered not just the estate but the conditions of her becoming. Every staged disclosure, every delayed piece of information, every test disguised as an orientation exercise. He had built an obstacle course and called it an inheritance. And she sat with the complicated weight of that, the gratitude and the anger at the gratitude, the love she felt for someone she'd never met pressing against the grief of having never met them, the specific loss of 34 years of a father she hadn't known she was missing because she hadn't known she had one. Near the end, his posture shifted. The precision relaxed into something she hadn't seen in the earlier parts of the recording, something closer to the unguarded. "I watched you," he said, "for 34 years. I know that sounds like, I know what it sounds like, but I want to tell you what I saw." He paused. "I saw someone who kept getting back up. Not because she was unbreakable, she wasn't. I watched her break, more than once, but she got back up and she kept going and she found ways to make things work with whatever she had available." He looked directly at the camera, at her, across the distance of whatever months had passed between his recording and her watching. "That's not something I gave you. That was yours before I ever designed anything. The rest? The organization, the archive, the money, the structure? That's infrastructure. The person who can use it well was already there. I just tried to make sure she had what she needed when she needed it." He stopped. He looked at his hands for a moment, and then back at the camera. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," he said. "I know that doesn't cover it. I know the math doesn't work. That what I built doesn't balance against what I didn't give you. I know that." He paused. "I hope you build something better with it than I did. I think you will. I watched you, and I think you will." The video ended. She sat in the dark for a long time, not crying. She had thought she might cry, but what happened was different, a kind of stillness that was the opposite of emptiness, that was full of something she couldn't name and didn't try to. Outside, the city went on, lights and traffic and millions of people living their lives in all their complicated, ordinary difficulty. She looked at it through the window, and she thought about her mother in a kitchen, stopping when a child appeared. She thought about a yellow dog named George, and a notebook with soft covers, and a woman who had chosen safety and hadn't been entirely sure it was right. She thought about a woman on courthouse steps in the rain with 3 garbage bags, and she thought about the distance between that woman and the one sitting in this office now. And she understood that the distance was not as large as it felt, that she was still that woman, would always be that woman, that what had happened was not a transformation into someone else but an expansion of what had always been there. She stood up. She put on her coat. She picked up her bag. Not a garbage bag, a bag she'd bought 3 days ago. Ordinary leather, nothing remarkable about it. And she went to the elevator and wrote it down and walked through the lobby and out the front door of the Hollander building onto the sidewalk. It was cold. Clear tonight. No rain. The sky, the specific dark blue of a city night, where the light pollution keeps it from going fully black. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing the cold air, and then she started walking. She walked for 40 minutes. Not toward anything specific, just walking, the way she'd learned to think, with movement, with the city around her, with the specific anonymity of being one person among many and not needing to be anything more than that for a little while. She walked past the hotel on Fletcher Street where she'd spent the first days. She slowed when she reached it and looked at the entrance, the same automatic doors, the same light spilling onto the sidewalk, and she thought about the woman who'd stood at that window looking at the air shaft and tried to locate the beginning of a future. She didn't stop. She kept walking. She walked back to the Hollander building by a longer route. Rossi was in the lobby when she came back through the door. She suspected he'd had someone tracking her location, which she would address in the morning, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has just spent 40 minutes exercising professional restraint. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Is Enzo still here?" "He went home an hour ago." "Call him tomorrow. I want to start working through the captain introductions. In person, not calls. I want to meet each of them on their own ground." She looked at Rossi. "Starting with Benedetti." Rossi nodded. He was doing the thing he did, taking a note without writing it down, the information going wherever it went in the internal architecture of a man who forgot nothing. "And Falcone?" he asked. She thought about it. Falcone is a captain in the Western region who has reduced operational scope and full knowledge that the ground under him can shift if he moves wrong. She paused. "Leave him there. Watch him. Don't crowd him." "That's a risk." "Yes," she said. "It's a calculated one." She looked at him. "I'm not interested in an organization run on fear alone. My father ran it that way and it produced Falcone. I'd rather have people who stay because the structure makes sense and the leadership earns it." She paused. "That includes you. I know you were watching me in those first weeks trying to decide. I know you made your decision somewhere around day 4. I want you to know I understand that's how it should work. You should be evaluating. Everyone should be evaluating. The day people stop evaluating is the day the thing stops being healthy." Rossi looked at her for a moment. He was a man who was not easily caught off balance, and he was not caught off balance now, but something in his expression recalibrated slightly. The small adjustment of someone who has been seen more precisely than they expected. "All right," he said. She took the elevator up. She sat at the desk for a little while longer, not working, just sitting in the room that had been her father's working space and was now hers, the room where decisions of significant weight had been made for 40 years, and she let herself feel the full specific strangeness of it, that she was here, that this was real, that the floor under her held. She opened her desk drawer and took out the USB drive and looked at it for a moment. Then she put it in the inside pocket of her coat, close to her chest, where she could feel it. She would watch it again. Not soon, maybe, but she would watch it again in the way that you return to things that are complicated and important and not yet finished being understood. She would carry it the way her mother had carried the quarterly wire transfers, acknowledged once a year in a single line, held without being crushed by. The woman who had walked out of that courthouse had believed the worst thing had already happened. She had been wrong about that. The worst thing had been the 12 years before the courthouse. The slow erosion of a person conducted so gradually that she'd stopped noticing it was happening. What had come after the courthouse was not rescue. It was not reversal. It was something harder than either of those things. The work of becoming someone who didn't need to be rescued in conditions that had not made the work easy, using tools she'd been handed and tools she'd found and tools she'd built with her own hands in the hours between midnight and 6 a.m. when everyone else was asleep. The organization was real, and it was hers, and it was complicated in every dimension that a thing built by human beings over 40 years of difficult choices was inevitably complicated. The Ashworth family would fulfill the terms of their restructuring, or they would face the consequences the documents provided for. The captains would be met in their own territories and assessed and managed with the combination of leverage and genuine relationship building that was the only durable basis for what she was trying to hold. Enzo would tell her things when they needed to be told, or she would hear about them from Rossi, and either way she would know. Falcone would make his calculations, and she would watch him make them and stay 2 steps ahead of wherever the calculations led. And the Vaughn Initiative would open its doors next month, and the first women would walk through them with whatever they were carrying, garbage bags maybe, or the invisible weight of things that don't fit in bags, and would find what was there waiting for them, which was not rescue but resources, not charity but infrastructure, not the version of help that tells you who you are, but the version that gives you what you need to find out for yourself. That part had been her idea. Not her father's, not Enzo's. Not the product of any plan that had been assembled in her absence. That part was hers in the way that the most important things are yours, because you reach for them from the specific place where you stood, from the particular history of everything that had happened to you and everything you'd managed to do with it. She turned off the light. She took the elevator down. She walked out of the building into the cold, clear night and hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of a furnished apartment the estate maintained and that she'd moved into 4 days ago, still getting used to sleeping in a room that didn't overlook an air shaft, still getting used to waking up without immediately calculating the balance of a checking account. In the cab, she looked out at the city moving past, the lights and the movement and the ordinary ongoing weight of millions of lives. She thought about her father in his limousine on that rainy night, watching her from across the street, making his decision. She thought about what he'd seen when he looked at her. The woman she'd been then, diminished and soaked and carrying her life in garbage bags. And she thought about what he would see now, and whether the distance between those two images was the distance he'd hoped for, or something different, something he couldn't have planned for because it had come from her rather than from anything he'd built. She thought it was both. She thought the thing she'd become was partly his architecture and partly the woman in the rain, and mostly the work of the past 3 weeks, which had not been survivable by a person who wasn't already, underneath all of it, exactly this. The cab stopped. She got out. She paid the driver. She stood on the sidewalk outside the building and looked up at the lit window of the apartment on the 4th floor and breathed the cold air and felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, the specific and uncomplicated fact of being exactly where she was, which was not where anyone had put her, but where she had put herself, carrying everything she'd lost and everything she'd found, standing in the cold in a city that did not know her name yet, but would, and being, for this one quiet moment at the end of everything, entirely enough. She went inside. The door closed behind her. The city went on.